Book 2, Chapter 22 of Resurrection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Chapter 22. An Old Friend. "Terrible," said Nekhlyudov as he went out into the waiting room with the advocate, who was arranging the papers in his portfolio. "In a matter which is perfectly clear they attach all the importance to the form and reject the appeal. Terrible." "The case was spoiled in the criminal court," said the advocate. "And Selenin, too, was in favour of the rejection. Terrible, terrible," Nekhlyudov repeated. "What is to be done now?" "We will appeal to His Majesty, and you can hand in the petition yourself while you are there. I will write it for you." At this moment little Wolf, with his stars and uniform, came out into the waiting room and approached Nekhlyudov. "It could not be helped, dear Prince. The reasons for an appeal were not sufficient," he said, shrugging his narrow shoulders and closing his eyes, and then he went his way. After Wolf, Selenin came out too, having heard from the senators that his old friend Nekhlyudov was there. "Well, I never expected to see you here," he said, coming up to Nekhlyudov and smiling only with his lips, while his eyes remained sad. "I did not know you were in Petersburg." "And I did not know you were public prosecutor in chief." "How is it you are in the Senate?" asked Selenin. "I had heard, by the way, that you were in Petersburg, but what are you doing here?" "Here? I am here because I hope to find justice and save a woman innocently condemned." "What woman?" "The one whose case has just been decided." "Oh, Maslova's case," said Selenin, suddenly remembering it. "The appeal had no grounds whatever." "It is not the appeal. It's the woman who is innocent and is being punished." Selenin sighed. "That may well be, but—" "No maybe, but is." "How do you know?" "Because I was on the jury. I know how we made the mistake." Selenin became thoughtful. "You should have made a statement at the time," he said. "I did make the statement." "It should have been put down in an official report. If this had been added to the petition for the appeal—" "Yes, but still, as it is, the verdict is evidently absurd." "The Senate has no right to say so. If the Senate took upon itself to repeal the decision of the law courts according to its own views as to the justice of the decisions in themselves, the verdict of the jury would lose all its meaning, not to mention that the Senate would have no basis to go upon, and would run the risk of infringing justice rather than upholding it," said Selenin, calling to mind the case that had just been heard. "All I know is that this woman is quite innocent, and that the last hope of saving her from an unmerited punishment is gone. The grossest injustice has been confirmed by the highest court." "It has not been confirmed. The Senate did not and cannot enter into the merits of the case in itself," said Selenin, always busy and rarely going out into society. He had evidently heard nothing of Nekhlyudov's romance. Nekhlyudov noticed it and made up his mind that it was best to say nothing about his special relations with Maslova. "You are probably staying with your aunt," Selenin remarked, apparently wishing to change the subject. "She told me you were here yesterday, and she invited me to meet you in the evening when some foreign preacher was to lecture," and Selenin again smiled, only with his lips. "Yes, I was there, but left in disgust," said Nekhlyudov angrily, vexed that Selenin had changed the subject. "Why with disgust? After all, it is a manifestation of religious feeling, though one-sided and sectarian," said Selenin. "Why, it's only some kind of whimsical folly." "Oh dear no. The curious thing is that we know the teaching of our Church so little that we see some new kind of revelation in what are, after all, our own fundamental dogmas," said Selenin, as if hurrying to let his old friend know his new views. Nekhludoff looked at Selenin scrutinizingly and with surprise, and Selenin dropped his eyes, in which appeared an expression not only of sadness but also of ill will. "Do you, then, believe in the dogmas of the Church?" Nekhludoff asked. "Of course I do," replied Selenin, gazing straight into Nekhludoff's eyes with a lifeless look. Nekhludoff sighed. "It is strange," he said. "However, we shall have a talk some other time," said Selenin. "I am coming," he added in answer to the usher, who had respectfully approached him. "Yes, we must meet again," he went on with a sigh. "But will it be possible for me to find you? You will always find me in at 7 o'clock. My address is Nadezhdinskaya," and he gave the number. "Ah, time does not stand still," and he turned to go, smiling only with his lips. "I will come if I can," said Nekhludoff, feeling that a man once near and dear to him had, by this brief conversation, suddenly become strange, distant, and incomprehensible, if not hostile to him. End of Book 2, Chapter 22. By Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 23. The Public Prosecutor. When Nekhludoff knew Selenin as a student, he was a good son, a true friend, and for his years an educated man of the world with much tact. Elegant, handsome, and at the same time truthful and honest. He learned well, without much exertion and with no pedantry, receiving gold medals for his essays. He considered the service of mankind, not only in words but in acts, to be the aim of his young life. He saw no other way of being useful to humanity than by serving the state. Therefore, as soon as he had completed his studies, he systematically examined all the activities to which he might devote his life, and decided to enter the second department of the Chancellery, where the laws are drawn up, and he did so. But in spite of the most scrupulous and exact discharge of the duties demanded of him, this service gave no satisfaction to his desire of being useful, nor could he awake in himself the consciousness that he was doing the right thing. This dissatisfaction was so much increased by the friction with his very small-minded and vain fellow officials that he left the Chancellery and entered the Senate. It was better there, but the same dissatisfaction still pursued him. He felt it to be very different from what he had expected and from what ought to be. And now that he was in the Senate, his relatives obtained for him the post of Gentleman of the Bedchamber, and he had to go in a carriage, dressed in an embroidered uniform and a white linen apron, to thank all sorts of people for having placed him in the position of a lackey. However much he tried, he could find no reasonable explanation for the existence of this post, and felt, more than in the Senate, that it was not the right thing. And yet he could not refuse it for fear of hurting those who felt sure they were giving him much pleasure by this appointment, and because it flattered the lowest part of his nature. It pleased him to see himself in a mirror in his gold-embroidered uniform, and to accept the deference paid him by some people because of his position. Something of the same kind happened when he was married. A very brilliant match, from a worldly point of view, was arranged for him, and he married chiefly because, by refusing, he would have had to hurt the young lady who wished to be married to him, and those who arranged the marriage, and also because a marriage with a nice young girl of noble birth flattered his vanity and gave him pleasure. But this marriage very soon proved to be even less the right thing than the government service and his position at court. After the birth of her first child, the wife decided to have no more, and began leading that luxurious worldly life in which he now had to participate, whether he liked or not. She was not particularly handsome, and was faithful to him, and she seemed, in spite of all the efforts it cost her, to derive nothing but weariness from the life she led. Yet she perseveringly continued to live it, though it was poisoning her husband's life. And all his efforts to alter this life were shattered, as against a stone wall, by her conviction, which all her friends and relatives supported, that all was as it should be. The child, a little girl with bare legs and long golden curls, was a being perfectly foreign to him, chiefly because she was trained quite otherwise than he wished her to be. There sprung up between the husband and wife the usual misunderstanding, without even the wish to understand each other, and then a silent warfare, hidden from outsiders and tempered by decorum. All this made his life at home a burden, and became even less the right thing than his service and his post. But it was above all his attitude towards religion which was not the right thing. Like every one of his set and his time, by the growth of his reason he broke without the least effort the nets of the religious superstitions in which he was brought up, and did not himself exactly know when it was that he freed himself of them. Being earnest and upright, he did not, during his youth and intimacy with Nekhlyudov as a student, conceal his rejection of the state religion. But as years went on and he rose in the service, and especially at the time of the reaction towards conservatism in society, his spiritual freedom stood in his way. At home, when his father died, he had to be present at the masses said for his soul, and his mother wished him to go to confession or to communion, and it was in a way expected by public opinion, but above all government service demanded that he should be present at all sorts of services, consecrations, thanksgivings, and the like. Hardly a day passed without some outward religious form having to be observed. When present at these services he had to pretend that he believed in something which he did not believe in, and being truthful he could not do this. The alternative was, having made up his mind that all these outward signs were deceitful, to alter his life in such a way that he would not have to be present at such ceremonials. But to do what seemed so simple would have cost a great deal. Besides encountering the perpetual hostility of all those who were near to him, he would have to give up the service and his position, and sacrifice his hopes of being useful to humanity by his service now and in the future. To make such a sacrifice, one would have to be firmly convinced of being right. And he was firmly convinced he was right, as no educated man of our time can help being convinced who knows little history and how the religions, and especially Church Christianity, originated. But under the stress of his daily life, he, a truthful man, allowed a little falsehood to creep in. He said that in order to do justice to an unreasonable thing, one had to study the unreasonable thing. It was a little falsehood, but it sunk him into the big falsehood in which he was now caught. Before putting to himself the question whether the orthodoxy in which he was born and bred, and which everyone expected him to accept, and without which he could not continue his useful occupation, contained the truth, he had already decided the answer. And to clear up the question, he did not read Voltaire, Schopenhauer, Herbert Spencer, or Comte, but the philosophical works of Hegel and the religious works of Vinet and Khomyakov, and naturally found in them what he wanted, i.e., something like peace of mind and a vindication of that religious teaching in which he was educated, which his reason had long ceased to accept, but without which his whole life was filled with unpleasantness, which could all be removed by accepting the teaching. And so he adopted all the usual sophistries which go to prove that a single human reason cannot know the truth, that the truth is only revealed to an association of men, and can only be known by revelation, that revelation is kept by the Church, etc. And so he managed to be present at prayers, masses for the dead, to confess, make signs of the cross in front of icons, with a quiet mind, without being conscious of the lie, and to continue in the service which gave him the feeling of being useful, and some comfort in his joyless family life. Although he believed this, he felt with his entire being that this religion of his, more than all else, was not the right thing, and that is why his eyes always looked sad. And seeing Nekhludoff, whom he had known before all these lies had rooted themselves within him, reminded him of what he then was. It was especially after he had hurried to hint at his religious views that he had most strongly felt all this not the right thing, and had become painfully sad. Nekhludoff felt it also after the first joy of meeting his old friend had passed, and therefore, though they promised each other to meet, they did not take any steps towards an interview, and did not again see each other during the stay of Nekhludoff's in Petersburg. End of Book 2, Chapter 23. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 24. Mariette tempts Nekhludoff. When they left the Senate, Nekhludoff and the advocate walked on together, the advocate having given the driver of his carriage orders to follow them. The advocate told Nekhludoff the story of the chief of a government department about whom the senators had been talking, how the thing was found out, and how the man who, according to law, should have been sent to the mines, had been appointed governor of a town in Siberia. Then he related with particular pleasure how several high-placed persons stole a lot of money collected for the erection of the still unfinished monument which they had passed that morning. Also how the mistress of so-and-so got a lot of money at the stock exchange, and how so-and-so agreed with so-and-so to sell him his wife. The advocate began another story about a swindle and all sorts of crimes committed by persons in high places, who, instead of being in prison, sat on presidential chairs in all sorts of government institutions. These tales, of which the advocate seemed to have an unending supply, gave him much pleasure, showing as they did with perfect clearness that his means of getting money were quite just and innocent compared to the means which the highest officials in Petersburg made use of. The advocate was therefore surprised when Nekhludoff took an izvozchik before hearing the end of the story, said good-bye, and left him. Nekhludoff felt very sad. It was chiefly the rejection of the appeal by the Senate, confirming the senseless torments that the innocent Maslova was enduring, that saddened him, and also the fact that this rejection made it still harder for him to unite his fate with hers. The stories about existing evils, which the advocate recounted with such relish, heightened his sadness, and so did the cold, unkind look that the once sweet-natured, frank, noble Selenin had given him, and which kept recurring to his mind. On his return the doorkeeper handed him a note, and said, rather scornfully, that some kind of woman had written it in the hall. It was a note from Shostova's mother. She wrote that she had come to thank her daughter's benefactor and saviour, and to implore him to come to see them on the Vasilievsky, 5th line, house number . This was very necessary because of Vera Doukhova. He need not be afraid that they would weary him with expressions of gratitude. They would not speak their gratitude, but be simply glad to see him. Would he not come next morning, if he could? There was another note from Bogotyrev, a former fellow officer, aide de camp to the Emperor, whom Nekhludoff had asked to hand personally to the Emperor his petition on behalf of the sectarians. Bogotyrev wrote in his large, firm hand that he would put the petition into the Emperor's own hands as he had promised, but that it had occurred to him that it might be better for Nekhludoff first to go and see the person on whom the matter depended. After the impressions received during the last few days, Nekhludoff felt perfectly hopeless of getting anything done. The plans he had formed in Moscow seemed now something like the dreams of youth, which are inevitably followed by disillusion when life comes to be faced. Still, being now in Petersburg, he considered it his duty to do all he had intended, and he resolved next day, after consulting Bogotyreff, to act on his advice and see the person on whom the case of the sectarians depended. He got out the sectarians' petition from his portfolio and began reading it over, when there was a knock at his door, and a footman came in with a message from the Countess Katerina Ivanovna, who asked him to come up and have a cup of tea with her. Nekhludoff said he would come at once, and having put the papers back into the portfolio, he went up to his aunt's. He looked out of a window on his way and saw Mariette's pair of bays standing in front of the house, and he suddenly brightened and felt inclined to smile. Mariette, with a hat on her head, not in black, but with a light dress of many shades, sat with a cup in her hand beside the Countess's easy-chair, prattling about something, while her beautiful laughing eyes glistened. She had said something funny, something indecently funny, just as Nekhludoff entered the room. He knew it by the way she laughed, and by the way the good-natured Countess Katerina Ivanovna's fat body was shaking with laughter, while Mariette, her smiling mouth slightly drawn to one side, her head a little bent, a peculiarly mischievous expression in her merry, energetic face, sat silently looking at her companion. From a few words which he overheard, Nekhludoff guessed that they were talking of the second piece of Petersburg news, the episode of the Siberian governor, and that it was in reference to this subject that Mariette had said something so funny that the Countess could not control herself for a long time. "You will kill me," she said, coughing. After saying "How do you do?" Nekhludoff sat down. He was about to censure Mariette in his mind for her levity, when, noticing the serious and even slightly dissatisfied look in his eyes, she suddenly, to please him, changed not only the expression of her face, but also the attitude of her mind, for she felt the wish to please him as soon as she looked at him. She suddenly turned serious, dissatisfied with her life, as if seeking and striving after something. It was not that she pretended, but she really reproduced in herself the very same state of mind that he was in, although it would have been impossible for her to express in words what was the state of Nekhludoff's mind at that moment. She asked him how he had accomplished his tasks. He told her about his failure in the Senate and his meeting Selenin. "Oh, what a pure soul! He is indeed a chevalier sans peur et sans reproche." "A pure soul," said both ladies, using the epithet commonly applied to Selenin in Petersburg society. "What is his wife like?" Nekhludoff asked. "His wife? Well, I do not wish to judge, but she does not understand him." "Is it possible that he, too, was for rejecting the appeal?" Mariette asked, with real sympathy. "It is dreadful. How sorry I am for her," she added, with a sigh. He frowned, and in order to change the subject, began to speak about Shoustova, who had been imprisoned in the fortress and was now set free through the influence of Mariette's husband. He thanked her for her trouble, and was going on to say how dreadful he thought it that this woman and the whole of her family had suffered merely because no one had reminded the authorities about them. But Mariette interrupted him and expressed her own indignation. "Say nothing about it to me," she said. "When my husband told me she could be set free, it was this that struck me. What was she kept in prison for if she is innocent?" She went on expressing what Nekhludoff was about to say. "It is revolting, revolting." Countess Katerina Ivanovna noticed that Mariette was coquetting with her nephew, and this amused her. "What do you think?" she said, when they were silent. "Supposing you come to Aline's to-morrow night. Kiesewetter will be there. And you too," she said, turning to Mariette. "Il vous a remarque," she went on to her nephew. "He told me that what you say I repeated it all to him is a very good sign, and that you will certainly come to Christ. You must come absolutely. Tell him to, Mariette, and come yourself." "Countess, in the first place, I have no right whatever to give any kind of advice to the Prince," said Mariette, and gave Nekhludoff a look that somehow established a full comprehension between them of their attitude in relation to the Countess's words and evangelicism in general. Secondly, I do not much care, you know. Yes, I know you always do things the wrong way round, and according to your own ideas. My own ideas? I have faith, like the most simple peasant woman," said Mariette with a smile. "And thirdly, I am going to the French theatre tomorrow night." "Ah, and have you seen that what's her name?" asked Countess Katerina Ivanovna. Mariette gave the name of a celebrated French actress. "You must go, most decidedly. She is wonderful." "Whom am I to see first, ma tante? The actress or the preacher?" Nekhludoff said with a smile. "Please don't catch at my words." "I should think the preacher first, and then the actress, or else the desire for the sermon might vanish altogether," said Nekhludoff. "No, better begin with the French theatre, and do penance afterwards. Now, then, you are not to hold me up for ridicule. The preacher is the preacher, and the theatre is the theatre. One need not weep in order to be saved. One must have faith, and then one is sure to be gay." "You, ma tante, preach better than any preacher." "Do you know what?" said Mariette. "Come into my box to morrow." "I am afraid I shall not be able to." The footman interrupted the conversation by announcing a visitor. It was the secretary of a philanthropic society of which the Countess was president. "Oh, that is the dullest of men. I think I shall receive him out there, and return to you later on. Mariette, give him his tea," said the Countess, and left the room with her quick, wriggling walk. Mariette took the glove off her firm, rather flat hand, the fourth finger of which was covered with rings. "Want any?" she said, taking hold of the silver teapot, under which a spirit lamp was burning, and extending her little finger curiously. Her face looked sad and serious. "It is always terribly painful to me to notice that people whose opinion I value confound me with the position I am placed in." She seemed ready to cry as she said these last words, and though these words had no meaning, or at any rate a very indefinite meaning, they seemed to be of exceptional depth, meaning, or goodness to Nekhludoff, so much was he attracted by the look of the bright eyes which accompanied the words of this young, beautiful, and well-dressed woman. Nekhludoff looked at her in silence and could not take his eyes from her face. "You think I do not understand, you and all that goes on in you? Why, everybody knows what you are doing. C'est le secret de Polichinelle. And I am delighted with your work, and think highly of you. Really, there is nothing to be delighted with, and I have done so little as yet. No matter, I understand your feelings, and I understand her. All right, all right, I will say nothing more about it," she said, noticing displeasure on his face. "But I also understand that after seeing all the suffering and the horror in the prisons," Mariette went on, her only desire that of attracting him, and guessing with her woman's instinct what was dear and important to him, "you wish to help the sufferers, those who are made to suffer so terribly by other men, and their cruelty and indifference. I understand the willingness to give one's life, and could give mine in such a cause, but we each have our own fate. Are you then dissatisfied with your fate?" "I?" she asked, as if struck with surprise that such a question could be put to her. "I have to be satisfied, and am satisfied. But there is a worm that wakes up, and he must not be allowed to fall asleep again. It is a voice that must be obeyed," Nekhludoff said, falling into the trap. Many a time later on, Nekhludoff remembered with shame his talk with her. He remembered her words, which were not so much lies as imitations of his own, and her face, which seemed looking at him with sympathetic attention when he told her about the terrors of the prison and of his impressions in the country. When the Countess returned they were talking, not merely like old, but like exclusive friends who alone understood one another. They were talking about the injustice of power, of the sufferings of the unfortunate, the poverty of the people. Yet in reality, in the midst of the sound of their talk, Their eyes, gazing at each other, kept asking, "Can you love me?" and answering, "I can," and the sex feeling, taking the most unexpected and brightest forms, drew them to each other. As she was going away, she told him she would always be willing to serve him in any way she could, and asked him to come and see her, if only for a moment, in the theatre next day, as she had a very important thing to tell him about. "Yes, and when shall I see you again?" she added with a sigh, carefully drawing the glove over her jewelled hand. "Say you will come." Nekhludoff promised. That night, when Nekhludoff was alone in his room and lay down after putting out his candle, he could not sleep. He thought of Maslova, of the decision of the Senate, of his resolve to follow her in any case, of his having given up the land. The face of Mariette appeared to him as if in answer to those thoughts. Her look, her sigh, her words, "When shall I see you again?" and her smile seemed vivid, as if he really saw her, and he also smiled. Shall I be doing right in going to Siberia, and have I done right in divesting myself of my wealth? And the answers to the questions on this Petersburg night, on which the daylight streamed into the window from under the blind, were quite indefinite. All seemed mixed in his head. He recalled his former state of mind and the former sequence of his thoughts, but they had no longer their former power or validity. And supposing I have invented all this and am unable to live it through? Supposing I repent of having acted right, he thought, and unable to answer, he was seized with such anguish and despair as he had long not felt. Unable to free himself from this perplexity, he fell into a heavy sleep, such as he had slept after a heavy loss at cards. End of Book 2, Chapter 24. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 25. Lydia Shostova's Home. Nekhludoff awoke next morning feeling as if he had been guilty of some iniquity the day before. He began considering. He could not remember having done anything wrong. He had committed no evil act, but he had had evil thoughts. He had thought that all his present resolutions to marry Katusha and to give up his land were unachievable dreams, that he should be unable to bear it, that it was artificial, unnatural, and that he would have to go on living as he lived. He had committed no evil action, but, what was far worse than an evil action, he had entertained evil thoughts, whence all evil actions proceed. An evil action may not be repeated and can be repented of, but evil thoughts generate all evil actions. An evil action only smooths the path for other evil acts. Evil thoughts uncontrollably drag one along that path. When Nekhludoff repeated in his mind the thoughts of the day before, he was surprised that he could for a moment have believed these thoughts. However new and difficult that which he had decided to do might be, he knew that it was the only possible way of life for him now, and however easy and natural it might have been to return to his former state, he knew that state to be death. Yesterday's temptation seemed like the feeling when one awakes from deep sleep, and without feeling sleepy wants to lie comfortably in a bed a little longer, yet knows that it is time to rise and commence the glad and important work that awaits one. On that, his last day in Petersburg, he went in the morning to the Valyevsky Ostrov to see Shastova. Shastova lived on the second floor, and having been shown the back stairs, Nekhludoff entered straight into the hot kitchen, which smelt strongly of food. An elderly woman with turned-up sleeves, with an apron and spectacles, stood by the fire stirring something in a steaming pan. "Whom do you want?" she asked severely, looking at him over her spectacles. Before Nekhludoff had time to answer, an expression of fright and joy appeared on her face. "Oh, Prince!" she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "But why have you come the back way? Our benefactor! I am her mother. They have nearly killed my little girl. You have saved us," she said, catching hold of Nekhludoff's hand and trying to kiss it. "I went to see you yesterday. My sister asked me to. She is here. This way, please," said Shoustova's mother, as she led the way through a narrow door and a dark passage, arranging her hair and pulling at her tucked-up skirt. "My sister's name is Kornilova. You must have heard of her," she added, stopping before a closed door. "She was mixed up in a political affair. An extremely clever woman." Shoustova's mother opened the door and showed Nekhludoff into a little room where, on a sofa with a table before it, sat a plump, short girl with fair hair that curled round her pale, round face, which was very like her mother's. She had a striped cotton blouse on. Opposite her, in an armchair, leaning forward so that he was nearly bent double, sat a young fellow with a slight black beard and moustaches. "Lydia, Prince Nekhludoff," he said. The pale girl jumped up, nervously pushing back a lock of hair behind her ear, and gazing at the newcomer with a frightened look in her large grey eyes. "So you are that dangerous woman whom Vera Doukhova wished me to intercede for?" Nekhludoff asked with a smile. "Yes, I am," said Lydia Shoustova, her broad, kind, childlike smile disclosing a row of beautiful teeth. "It was Aunt who was so anxious to see you. Aunt!" she called out in a pleasant, tender voice through the door. "Your imprisonment grieved Vera Doukhova very much," said Nekhludoff. "Take a seat here, or better here," said Shoustova, pointing to a battered easy chair from which the young man had just risen. "My cousin Zakharov," she said, noticing that Nekhludoff looked at the young man. The young man greeted the visitor with a smile as kindly as Shoustova's, and when Nekhludoff sat down, he brought himself another chair and sat by his side. A fair-haired schoolboy of about 10 also came into the room and silently sat down on the window-sill. "Vera Doukhova is a great friend of my aunt's, but I hardly know her," said Shoustova. Then a woman with a very pleasant face, with a white blouse and leather belt, came in from the next room. "How do you do? Thanks for coming," she began as soon as she had taken the place next to Shoustova's on the sofa. "Well, and how is Vera? You have seen her? How does she bear her fate?" "She does not complain," said Nekhludoff. "She says she feels perfectly happy." "Ah, that's like Vera. I know her," said the aunt, smiling and shaking her head. "One must know her. She has a fine character. Everything for others, nothing for herself." "No, she asked nothing for herself, but only seemed concerned about your niece. What seemed to trouble her most was, as she said, that your niece was imprisoned for nothing." "Yes, that's true," said the aunt. "It is a dreadful business. She suffered, in reality, because of me." "Not at all, aunt. I should have taken the papers without you, all the same." "Allow me to know better," said the aunt. "You see," she went on to Nekhludoff, "it all happened because a certain person asked me to keep his papers for a time, and I, having no house at the time, brought them to her. And that very night the police searched her room and took her and the papers, and have kept her up to now, demanding that she should say from whom she had them." "But I never told them," said Shoustova quickly, pulling nervously at a lock that was not even out of place. "I never said you did," answered the aunt. "If they took Mitten up, it was certainly not through me," said Shoustova, blushing, and looking round uneasily. "Don't speak about it, Lydia dear," said her mother. "Why not? I should like to relate it," said Shoustova, no longer smiling nor pulling her lock, but twisting it round her finger and getting redder. "Don't forget what happened yesterday when you began talking about it." "Not at all. Leave me alone, mamma. I did not tell. I only kept quiet. When he examined me about Mitin and about Aunt, I said nothing, and told him I would not answer. Then this Petrov—" "Petrov is a spy, a gendarme, and a blackguard," put in the aunt, to explain her niece's words to Nekhludoff. "Then he began persuading," continued Shoustova, excitedly and hurriedly. "Anything you tell me," he said, "can harm no one. On the contrary, if you tell me, we may be able to set free innocent people whom we may be uselessly tormenting." Well, I still said I would not tell. Then he said, "All right, don't tell, but do not deny what I am going to say," and he named Mitin. "Don't talk about it," said the aunt. "Oh, aunt, don't interrupt." And she went on, pulling the lock of hair and looking around. "And then, only fancy, the next day I hear they let me know by knocking at the wall that Mitin is arrested. Well, I think I've betrayed him, and this tormented me so, that I nearly went mad." "And it turned out that it was not at all because of you he was taking up." "Yes, but I didn't know. I think, there now, I've betrayed him. I walk and walk up and down from wall to wall, and cannot help thinking, I think I've betrayed him. I lie down and cover myself up, and hear something whispering, 'Betrayed, betrayed, Mitin, Mitin betrayed.' I know it is an hallucination, but cannot help listening. I wish to fall asleep, I cannot. I wish not to think, and cannot cease. That is terrible." As Shoustova spoke, she got more and more excited, and twisted and untwisted the lock of hair around her finger. "Lydia, dear, be calm," the mother said, touching her shoulder, but Shoustova could not stop herself. "It is all the more terrible," she began again, but did not finish, and jumping up with a cry, rushed out of the room. Her mother turned to follow her. "They ought to be hanged, the rascals," said the schoolboy who was sitting on the window sill. "What's that?" said the mother. "I only said—" "Oh, it's nothing," the schoolboy answered, and taking a cigarette that lay on the table, he began to smoke. End of Book 2, Chapter 25. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 26. Lydia's Aunt. "Yes, that solitary confinement is terrible for the young," said the aunt, shaking her head and also lighting a cigarette. "I should say for every one," Nekhludoff replied. "No, not for all," answered the aunt. "For the real revolutionists, I have been told, it is rest and quiet. A man who is wanted by the police lives in continual anxiety, material want, and fear for himself and others, and for his cause, and at last, when he is taken up, and it is all over, and all responsibility is off his shoulders, he can sit and rest. I have been told they actually feel joyful when taken up. But the young and innocent, they always first arrest the innocent, like Lydia. For them the first shock is terrible. It is not that they deprive you of freedom, and the bad food and bad air, all that is nothing. 3 times as many privations would be easily borne if it were not for the moral shock when one is first taken. Have you experienced it?" "I? I was twice in prison," she answered, with a sad, gentle smile. "When I was arrested for the first time, I had done nothing. I was 22, had a child, and was expecting another. Though the loss of freedom and the parting with my child and husband were hard, they were nothing when compared with what I felt when I found out that I had ceased being a human creature and had become a thing. I wished to say good-bye to my little daughter. I was told to go and get into the trap. I asked where I was being taken to. The answer was that I should know when I got there. I asked what I was accused of, but got no reply. After I had been examined, and after they had undressed me and put numbered prison clothes on me, they led me to a vault, opened a door, pushed me in, and left me alone. A sentinel with a loaded gun paced up and down in front of my door, and every now and then looked in through a crack. I felt terribly depressed. What struck me most at the time was that the gendarme officer who examined me offered me a cigarette. So he knew that people liked smoking, and must know that they liked freedom and light, and that mothers love their children and children know mothers. Then how could they tear me pitilessly from all that was dear to me, and lock me up in prison like a wild animal? That sort of thing could not be borne without evil effects. Anyone who believes in God and men, and believes that men love one another, will cease to believe it after all that. I have ceased to believe in humanity since then, and have grown embittered," she finished, with a smile. Shoustova's mother came in at the door through which her daughter had gone out, and said that Lydia was very much upset, and would not come in again. "And what has this young life been ruined for?" said the aunt. "What is especially painful to me is that I am the involuntary cause of it." "She will recover in the country, with God's help," said the mother. "We shall send her to her father." "Yes, if it were not for you she would have perished altogether," said the aunt. "Thank you. But what I wish to see you for is this. I wish to ask you to take a letter to Vera Doukhova," and she got the letter out of her pocket. "The letter is not closed. You may read and tear it up, or hand it to her, according to how far it coincides with your principles," she said. "It contains nothing compromising." Nekhludoff took the letter, and, having promised to give it to Vera Doukhova, he took his leave and went away. He sealed the letter without reading it, meaning to take it to its destination. End of Book 2, Chapter 26. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 27. The State, Church, and the People. The last thing that kept Nekhludoff in Petersburg was the case of the sectarians, whose petition he intended to get his former fellow officer, aide-de-camp Bogotyreff, to hand to the Tsar. He came to Bogotyreff in the morning, and found him about to go out, though still at breakfast. Bogotyreff was not tall, but firmly built and wonderfully strong. He could bend a horseshoe. A kind, honest, straight, and even liberal man. In spite of these qualities he was intimate at court and very fond of the Tsar and his family, and by some strange method he managed, while living in that highest circle, to see nothing but the good in it, and to take no part in the evil and the corruption. He never condemned anybody nor any measure, and either kept silent or spoke in a bold, loud voice, almost shouting what he had to say, and often laughing in the same boisterous manner. And he did not do it for diplomatic reasons, but because such was his character. "Ah, that's right that you have come. Would you like some breakfast? Sit down, the beefsteaks are fine. I always begin with something substantial. Begin and finish too. Ha ha ha! Well then, have a glass of wine," he shouted, pointing to a decanter of claret. "I have been thinking of you. I will hand on the petition. I shall put it into his own hands. You may count on that. Only it occurred to me that it would be best for you to call on Toporoff." Nekhludoff made a wry face at the mention of Toporoff. "It all depends on him. He will be consulted anyhow, and perhaps he may himself meet your wishes." "If you advise it, I shall go." "That's right. Well, and how does Petersburg agree with you?" shouted Bogotyreff. "Tell me, eh?" "I feel myself getting hypnotized," replied Nekhludoff. "Hypnotized!" Bogotyreff repeated, and burst out laughing. You won't have anything? Well, just as you please," and he wiped his moustaches with his napkin. "Then you'll go, eh? If he does not do it, give the petition to me, and I shall hand it on to morrow." Shouting these words, he rose, crossed himself just as naturally as he had wiped his mouth, and began buckling on his sword. "And now, good bye. I must go. We are both going out," said Nekhludoff, and shaking Bogotyreff's strong, broad hand, and with the sense of pleasure which the impression of something healthy and unconsciously fresh always gave him, Nekhludoff parted from Bogotyreff on the doorsteps. Though he expected no good result from his visit, still Nekhludoff, following Bogotyreff's advice, went to see Toporoff, on whom the sectarian's fate depended. The position occupied by Toporoff, involving as it did an incongruity of purpose, could only be held by a dull man devoid of moral sensibility. Toporoff possessed both these negative qualities. The incongruity of the position he occupied was this: it was his duty to keep up and to defend by external measures, not excluding violence, that Church which, by its own declaration, was established by God Himself, and could not be shaken by the gates of hell nor by anything human. This divine and immutable God-established institution had to be sustained and defended by a human institution, the Holy Synod, managed by Toporoff and his officials. Toporoff did not see this contradiction, nor did he wish to see it, and he was, therefore, much concerned lest some Romish priest, some pastor, or some sectarian should destroy that church which the gates of hell could not conquer. Toporoff, like all those who are quite destitute of the fundamental religious feeling that recognizes the equality and brotherhood of men, was fully convinced that the common people were creatures entirely different from himself, and that the people needed what he could very well do without, for at the bottom of his heart he believed in nothing, and found such a state very convenient and pleasant. Yet he feared lest the people might also come to such a state, and looked upon it as his sacred duty, as he called it, to save the people therefrom. A certain cookery book declares that some crabs like to be boiled alive. In the same way he thought and spoke as if the people liked being kept in superstition, only he meant this in a literal sense, whereas the cookery book did not mean its words literally. His feelings towards the religion he was keeping up were the same as those of the poultry keeper towards the carrion he fed his fowls on. Carrion was very disgusting, but the fowls liked it. Therefore it was right to feed the fowls on carrion. Of course, all this worship of the images of the Iberian, Kazan, and Smolensk mothers of God was a gross superstition, but the people liked it and believed in it, and therefore the superstition must be kept up. Thus thought Toporoff, not considering that the people only liked superstition because there always have been, and still are, men like himself who, being enlightened, instead of using their light to help others to struggle out of their dark ignorance, use it to plunge them still deeper into it. When Nekhludoff entered the reception room, Toporoff was in his study, talking with an abbess, a lively and aristocratic lady, who was spreading the Greek Orthodox faith in Western Russia among the Uniates, who acknowledge the Pope of Rome, and who have the Greek religion enforced on them. An official who was in the reception room inquired what Nekhludoff wanted, and when he heard that Nekhludoff meant to hand in a petition to the Emperor, he asked him if he would allow the petition to be read first. Nekhludoff gave it to him, and the official took it into the study. The abbess, with her hood and flowing veil and her long train trailing behind, left the study and went out, her white hands, with their well-tended nails, holding a topaz rosary. Nekhludoff was not immediately asked to come in. Toporoff was reading the petition and shaking his head. He was unpleasantly surprised by the clear and emphatic wording of it. "If it gets into the hands of the Emperor, it may cause misunderstandings. and unpleasant questions may be asked," he thought as he read. Then he put the petition on the table, rang, and ordered Nekhludoff to be asked in. He remembered the case of the sectarians. He had had a petition from them before. The case was this: these Christians, fallen away from the Greek Orthodox Church, were first exhorted and then tried by law, but were acquitted. Then the archdeacon and the governor arranged, on the plea that their marriages were illegal, to exile these sectarians, separating the husbands, wives, and children. These fathers and wives were now petitioning that they should not be parted. Toporov recollected the first time the case came to his notice. He had at that time hesitated whether he had not better put a stop to it, but then he thought no harm could result from his confirming the decision to separate and exile the different members of the sectarian families, whereas allowing the peasant sect to remain where it was might have a bad effect on the rest of the inhabitants of the place and cause them to fall away from orthodoxy. And then the affair also proved the zeal of the archdeacon, and so he let the case proceed along the lines it had taken. But now that they had a defender such as Nekhludoff, who had some influence in Petersburg, the case might be specially pointed out to the Emperor as something cruel, or it might get into the foreign papers. Therefore he at once took an unexpected decision. "How do you do?" he said, with the air of a very busy man, receiving Nekhludoff standing, and at once starting on the business. "I know this case. As soon as I saw the names I recollected this unfortunate business," he said, taking up the petition and showing it to Nekhludoff, "and I am much indebted to you for reminding me of it. It is the overzealousness of the provincial authorities." Nekhludoff stood silent, looking with no kindly feelings at the immovable, pale mask of a face before him. "And I shall give orders that these measures should be revoked and the people reinstated in their homes." "So that I need not make use of this petition?" "I promise you most assuredly," answered Toporov, laying a stress on the word "I," as if quite convinced that his honesty, his word, was the best guarantee. "It will be best if I write at once. Take a seat, please." He went up to the table and began to write. As Nekhludoff sat down, he looked at the narrow, bald skull, at the fat, blue-veined hand that was swiftly guiding the pen, and wondered why this evidently indifferent man was doing what he did, and why he was doing it with such care. "Well, here you are," said Toporov, sealing the envelope. "You may let your clients know," and he stretched his lips to imitate a smile. "Then what did these people suffer for?" Nekhludoff asked, as he took the envelope. Toporov raised his head and smiled, as if Nekhludoff's question gave him pleasure. "That I cannot tell. All I can say is that the interests of the people guarded by us are so important that too great a zeal in matters of religion is not so dangerous or so harmful as the indifference which is now spreading." "But how is it that in the name of religion the very first demands of righteousness are violated? Families are separated." Toporov continued to smile patronizingly, evidently thinking what Nekhludoff said very pretty. Anything that Nekhludoff could say he would have considered very pretty and very one-sided from the height of what he considered his far-reaching office in the state. "It may seem so from the point of view of a private individual," he said, "but from an administrative point of view it appears in a rather different light. However, I must bid you good-bye now," said Toporov, bowing his head and holding out his hand, which Nekhludoff pressed. "The interests of the people? Your interests is what you mean," thought Nekhludoff as he went out, and he ran over in his mind the people in whom is manifested the activity of the institutions that uphold religion and educate the people. He began with the woman punished for the illicit sale of spirits, the boy for theft, the tramp for tramping, the incendiary for setting a house on fire, the banker for fraud, and that unfortunate Lydia Shostova, imprisoned only because they hoped to get such information as they required from her. Then he thought of the sectarians punished for violating orthodoxy, and Gorkovitch for wanting constitutional government, and Nekhludoff clearly saw that all these people were arrested, locked up, exiled, not really because they transgressed against justice or behaved unlawfully, but only because they were an obstacle hindering the officials and the rich from enjoying the property they had taken away from the people. And the woman who sold wine without having a license, and the thief knocking about the town, and Lydia Shostova hiding proclamations, and the sectarians upsetting superstitions, and Gorkovitch desiring a constitution, were a real hindrance. It seemed perfectly clear to Nekhludoff that all these officials, beginning with his aunt's husband, the senators and Toporov, down to those clean and correct gentlemen who sat at the tables in the ministry office, were not at all troubled by the fact that in such a state of things the innocent had to suffer, but were only concerned how to get rid of the really dangerous, so that the rule that 10 guilty should escape rather than that one innocent should be condemned was not observed, but on the contrary, for the sake of getting rid of one really dangerous person, 10 who seemed dangerous were punished, as, when cutting a rotten piece out of anything, one has to cut away some that is good. This explanation seemed very simple and clear to Nekhludoff, but its very simplicity and clearness made him hesitate to accept it. Was it possible that so complicated a phenomenon could have so simple and terrible an explanation? Was it possible that all these words about justice, law, religion, God, and so on, were mere words, hiding the coarsest cupidity and cruelty? End of Book 2, Chapter 27. By Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 28. The Meaning of Mariette's Attraction. Nekhludoff would have left Petersburg on the evening of the same day, but he had promised Mariette to meet her at the theatre, and though he knew that he ought not to keep that promise, he deceived himself into the belief that it would not be right to break his word. Am I capable of withstanding these temptations? He asked himself, not quite honestly. I shall try for the last time. He dressed in his evening clothes and arrived at the theatre during the second act of the eternal Dame aux Camélias, in which a foreign actress once again, and in a novel manner, showed how women die of consumption. The theatre was quite full. Mariette's box was at once, and with great deference, shown to Nekhludoff at his request. A liveried servant stood in the corridor outside. He bowed to Nekhludoff as to one whom he knew, and opened the door of the box. All the people who sat and stood in the boxes on the opposite side, those who sat near and those who were in the parterre, with their grey, grizzly, bald, or curly heads, all were absorbed in watching the thin, bony actress who, dressed in silks and laces, was wriggling before them and speaking in an unnatural voice. Someone called "Hush!" when the door opened, and two streams, one of cool, the other of hot, air touched Nekhludoff's face. Mariette and a lady whom he did not know, with a red cape and a big, heavy head-dress, were in the box, and two men also, Mariette's husband, the general, a tall, handsome man with a severe, inscrutable countenance, a Roman nose, and a uniform padded round the chest, and a fair man with a bit of shaved chin between pompous whiskers. Mariette, graceful, slight, elegant, her low neck dress showing her firm, shapely, slanting shoulders, with a little black mole where they joined her neck, immediately turned and pointed with her face to a chair behind her in an engaging manner, and smiled a smile that seemed full of meaning to Nekhludoff. The husband looked at him in the quiet way in which he did everything, and bowed. In the look he exchanged with his wife, the master, the owner of a beautiful woman, was to be seen at once. When the monologue was over, the theatre resounded with the clapping of hands. Mariette rose, and holding up her rustling silk skirt, went into the back of the box and introduced Nekhludoff to her husband. The General, without ceasing to smile with his eyes, said he was very pleased, and then sat inscrutably silent. "I ought to have left to-day, had I not promised," said Nekhludoff to Mariette. "If you do not care to see me," said Mariette, in answer to what his words implied, "you will see a wonderful actress. Was she not splendid in the last scene?" she asked, turning to her husband. The husband bowed his head. "This sort of thing does not touch me," said Nekhludoff. "I have seen so much real suffering lately that—" "Yes, sit down and tell me." The husband listened, his eyes smiling more and more ironically. "I have been to see that woman whom they have set free, and who has been kept in prison for so long. She is quite broken down." "That is the woman I spoke to you about," Mariette said to her husband. "Oh, yes, I was very pleased that she could be set free," said the husband quietly, nodding and smiling under his moustache with evident irony, so it seemed to Nekhludoff. "I shall go and have a smoke." Nekhludoff sat waiting to hear what the something was that Mariette had to tell him. She said nothing, and did not even try to say anything, but joked and spoke about the performance, which she thought ought to touch Nekhludoff. Nekhludoff saw that she had nothing to tell, but only wished to show herself to him in all the splendour of her evening toilet, with her shoulders and little mole, and this was pleasant and yet repulsive to him. The charm that had veiled all this sort of thing from Nekhludoff was not removed, but it was as if he could see what lay beneath. Looking at Mariette, he admired her, and yet he knew that she was a liar, living with a husband who was making his career by means of the tears and lives of hundreds and hundreds of people, and that she was quite indifferent about it, and that all she had said the day before was untrue. What she wanted, neither he nor she knew why, was to make him fall in love with her. This both attracted and disgusted him. Several times, on the point of going away, he took up his hat and then stayed on. But at last, when the husband returned with a strong smell of tobacco in his thick moustache, and looked at Nekhludoff with a patronizing, contemptuous air, as if not recognizing him, Nekhludoff left the box before the door was closed again, found his overcoat, and went out of the theatre. As he was walking home along the Nevsky, he could not help noticing a well-shaped and aggressively finely dressed woman who was quietly walking in front of him along the broad asphalt pavement. The consciousness of her detestable power was noticeable in her face and the whole of her figure. All who met or passed that woman looked at her. Nekhludoff walked faster than she did, and involuntarily also looked her in the face. The face, which was probably painted, was handsome, and the woman looked at him with a smile, and her eyes sparkled. And curiously enough, Nekhludoff was suddenly reminded of Mariette, because he again felt both attracted and disgusted, just as when in the theatre. Having hurriedly passed her, Nekhludoff turned off onto the Morskaya and passed on to the embankment, where, to the surprise of a policeman, he began pacing up and down the pavement. "The other one gave me just such a smile when I entered the theatre," he thought, "and the meaning of the smile was the same. The only difference is that this one said plainly, 'If you want me, take me; if not, go your way,' and the other one pretended that she was not thinking of this, but living in some high and refined state, while this was really at the root. Besides, this one was driven to it by necessity, while the other amused herself by playing with that enchanting, disgusting, frightful passion. This woman of the street was like stagnant, smelling water offered to those whose thirst was greater than their disgust. That other one in the theatre was like the poison which, unnoticed, poisons everything it gets into." Nekhludoff recalled his liaison with the Marechal's wife, and shameful memories rose before him. "The animalism of the brute nature in man is disgusting," thought he, "but as long as it remains in its naked form, we observe it from the height of our spiritual life and despise it, and, whether one has fallen or resisted, one remains what one was before. But when that same animalism hides under a cloak of poetry and aesthetic feeling and demands our worship, then we are swallowed up by it completely and worship animalism, no longer distinguishing good from evil. Then it is awful." Nekhludoff perceived all this now as clearly as he saw the palace, the sentinels, the fortress, the river, the boats, and the stock exchange. And just as on this northern summer night there was no restful darkness on the earth, but only a dismal, dull light coming from an invisible source, so in Nekhludoff's soul there was no longer the restful darkness, ignorance. Everything seemed clear. It was clear that everything considered important and good was insignificant and repulsive, and that all the glamour and luxury hid the old well-known crimes, which not only remained unpunished, but were adorned with all the splendour which men were capable of inventing. Nekhludoff wished to forget all this, not to see it, but he could no longer help seeing it, though he could not see the source of the light which revealed it to him any more than he could see the source of the light which lay over Petersburg. And though the light appeared to him dull, dismal, and unnatural, yet he could not help seeing what it revealed, and he felt both joyful and anxious. End of Book 2, Chapter 28. By Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 29. For Her Sake and for God's. On his return to Moscow, Nekhludoff went at once to the prison hospital to bring Maslova the sad news that the Senate had confirmed the decision of the court, and that she must prepare to go to Siberia. He had little hope of the success of his petition to the Emperor, which the advocate had written for him, and which he now brought with him for Maslova to sign. And, strange to say, he did not at present even wish to succeed. He had got used to the thoughts of going to Siberia and living among the exiled and the convicts, and he could not easily picture to himself how his life and Maslova's would shape if she were acquitted. He remembered the thought of the American writer, Thoreau, who at the time when slavery existed in America said that, under a government that imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. Nekhludoff, especially after his visit to Petersburg and all he discovered then, thought in the same way. Yes, the only place befitting an honest man in Russia at the present time is a prison, he thought, and even felt that this applied to him personally when he drove up to the prison and entered its walls. The doorkeeper recognized Nekhludoff and told him at once that Maslova was no longer there. "Where is she, then?" "In the cell again." "Why has she been removed?" Nekhludoff asked. "Oh, your Excellency, what are such people?" said the doorkeeper contemptuously. "She's been carrying on with the medical assistant, so the head doctor ordered her back." Nekhludoff had had no idea how dear Maslova and the state of her mind were to him. He was stunned by the news. He felt as one feels at the news of a great and unforeseen misfortune, and his pain was very severe. His first feeling was one of shame. He, with his joyful idea of the change that he imagined was going on in her soul, now seemed ridiculous in his own eyes. He thought that all her pretence of not wishing to accept his sacrifice, all the reproaches and tears, were only the devices of a depraved woman who wished to use him to the best advantage. He seemed to remember having seen signs of obduracy at his last interview with her. All this flashed through his mind as he instinctively put on his hat and left the hospital. What am I to do now? Am I still bound to her? Has this action of hers not set me free? and as he put these questions to himself he knew at once that if he considered himself free and threw her up he would be punishing himself and not her, which was what he wished to do, and he was seized with fear. No, what has happened cannot alter, it can only strengthen my resolve. Let her do what flows from the state her mind is in. If it is carrying on with the medical assistant, let her carry on with the medical assistant. That is her business. I must do what my conscience demands of me, and my conscience expects me to sacrifice my freedom. My resolution to marry her, if only in form, and to follow wherever she may be sent, remains unalterable." Nekhludoff said all this to himself with vicious obstinacy as he left the hospital and walked with resolute steps towards the big gates of the prison. He asked the warder on duty at the gate to inform the inspector that he wished to see Maslova. The warder knew Nekhludoff and told him of an important change that had taken place in the prison. The old inspector had been discharged and a new, very severe official appointed in his place. "They are so strict nowadays, it's just awful," said the jailer. "He is in here. They will let him know directly." The new inspector was in the prison and soon came to Nekhludoff. He was a tall, angular man with high cheekbones, morose and very slow in his movements. "Interviews are allowed in the visiting room on the appointed days," he said, without looking at Nekhludoff. "But I have a petition to the Emperor which I want signed." "You can give it to me." "I must see the prisoner myself. I was always allowed to before." "That was so before," said the inspector, with a furtive glance at Nekhludoff. "I have a permission from the governor," insisted Nekhludoff, and took out his pocket book. "Allow me," said the inspector, taking the paper from Nekhludoff with his long, dry, white fingers, on the first of which was a gold ring, still without looking him in the eyes. He read the paper slowly. "Step into the office, please." This time the office was empty. The inspector sat down by the table and began sorting some papers that lay on it, evidently intending to be present at the interview. When Nekhludoff asked whether he might see the political prisoner Doukhova, the inspector answered shortly that he could not. "Interviews with political prisoners are not permitted," he said, and again fixed his attention on his papers. With the letter to Doukhova in his pocket, Nekhludoff felt as if he had committed some offence, and his plans had been discovered and frustrated. When Maslova entered the room, the inspector raised his head, and without looking at either her or Nekhludoff, remarked, "You may talk," and went on sorting his papers. Maslova had again the white jacket, petticoat, and kerchief on. When she came up to Nekhludoff and saw his cold, hard look, she blushed scarlet, and crumbling the hem of her jacket with her hand, she cast down her eyes. Her confusion, so it seemed to Nekhludoff, confirmed the hospital doorkeeper's words. Nekhludoff had meant to treat her in the same way as before, but could not bring himself to shake hands with her, so disgusting was she to him now. "I have brought you bad news," he said in a monotonous tone, without looking at her or taking her hand. "The Senate has refused." "I knew it would," she said in a strange tone, as if she were gasping for breath. Formerly Nekhludoff would have asked why she said she knew it would. Now he only looked at her. Her eyes were full of tears, but this did not soften him. It roused his irritation against her even more. The inspector rose and began pacing up and down the room. In spite of the disgust Nekhludoff was feeling at the moment, he considered it right to express his regret at the Senate's decision. "You must not despair," he said. "The petition to the Emperor may meet with success, and I hope—" "I'm not thinking of that," she said, looking piteously at him with her wet, squinting eyes. "What is it, then?" "You have been to the hospital, and they have most likely told you about me." "What of that? That is your affair," said Nekhludoff coldly, and frowned. The cruel feeling of wounded pride that had quieted down rose with renewed force when she mentioned the hospital. He, a man of the world, whom any girl of the best families would think it happiness to marry, offered himself as husband to this woman, and she could not even wait, but began intriguing with the medical assistant, thought he with a look of hatred. "Here, sign this petition," he said, taking a large envelope from his pocket and laying the paper on the table. She wiped the tears with a corner of her kerchief and asked what to write and where. He showed her, and she sat down and arranged the cuff of her right sleeve with her left hand. He stood behind her and silently looking at her back, which shook with suppressed emotion, and evil and good feelings were fighting in his breast, feelings of wounded pride and of pity for her who was suffering, and the last feeling was victorious. He could not remember which came first. Did the pity for her first enter his heart, or did he first remember his own sins, his own repulsive actions, the very same for which he was condemning her? Anyhow, he both felt himself guilty and pitied her. Having signed the petition and wiped her inky finger on her petticoat, she got up and looked at him. "Whatever happens, whatever comes of it, my resolve remains unchanged," said Nekhludoff. The thought that he had forgiven her heightened his feeling of pity and tenderness for her, and he wished to comfort her. "I will do what I have said. Wherever they take you, I shall be with you." "What's the use?" she interrupted hurriedly, though her whole face lighted up. "Think what you will want on the way." "I don't know of anything in particular, thank you." The inspector came up, and without waiting for a remark from him, Nekhludoff took leave and went out with peace, joy, and love towards everybody in his heart, such as he had never felt before. The certainty that no action of Maslova could change his love for her filled him with joy, and raised him to a level which he had never before attained. Let her intrigue with the medical assistant. That was her business. He loved her not for his own, but for her sake and for God's. And this intrigue, for which Maslova was turned out of the hospital, and of which Nekhludoff believed she was really guilty, consisted of the following. Maslova was sent by the head nurse to get some herb tea from the dispensary at the end of the corridor, and there, all alone, she found the medical assistant, a tall man with a blotchy face, who had for a long time been bothering her. In trying to get away from him, Maslova gave him such a push that he knocked his head against a shelf, from which 2 bottles fell and broke. The head doctor, who was passing at that moment, heard the sound of breaking glass, saw Maslova run out, quite red, and shouted to her, "Ah, my good woman, if you start intriguing here, I'll send you about your business. What is the meaning of it?" he went on, addressing the medical assistant and looking at him over his spectacles. The assistant smiled and began to justify himself. The doctor gave no heed to him, but lifting his head so that he now looked through his spectacles, he entered the ward. He told the inspector the same day to send another, more sedate assistant nurse in Maslova's place. And this was her intrigue with the medical assistant. Being turned out for a love intrigue was particularly painful to Maslova, because the relations with men, which had long been repulsive to her, had become specially disgusting after meeting Nekhludoff. The thought that, judging her by her past and present position, every man, the blotchy assistant among them, considered he had a right to offend her, and was surprised at her refusal, hurt her deeply, and made her pity herself, and brought tears to her eyes. When she went out to Nekhludoff this time, she wished to clear herself of the false charge, which she knew he would certainly have heard about. But when she began to justify herself, she felt he did not believe her, and that her excuses would only strengthen his suspicions. Tears choked her, and she was silent. Maslova still thought, and continued to persuade herself, that she had never forgiven him, and hated him, as she told him at their second interview. But in reality she loved him again, and loved him so that she did all he wished her to do, left off drinking, smoking, coquetting, and entered the hospital because she knew he wished it. And if every time he reminded her of it, she refused so decidedly to accept his sacrifice and marry him, it was because she liked repeating the proud words she had once uttered, and because she knew that a marriage with her would be a misfortune for him. She had resolutely made up her mind that she would not accept his sacrifice, and yet the thought that he despised her and believed that she still was what she had been, and did not notice the change that had taken place in her, was very painful. That he could still think she had done wrong while in the hospital tormented her more than the news that her sentence was confirmed. End of Book 2, Chapter 29. Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 30. The astonishing institution called criminal law. Maslova might be sent off with the first gang of prisoners, therefore Nekhlyudov got ready for his departure. But there was so much to be done that he felt that he could not finish it, however much time he might have. It was quite different now from what it had been. Formerly he used to be obliged to look for an occupation, the interests of which always centered in one person, i.e., Dmitri Ivanovitch Nekhlyudov, and yet, though every interest of his life was thus centered, all these occupations were very wearisome. Now all his occupations related to other people, and not to Dmitri Ivanovitch, and they were all interesting and attractive, and there was no end to them. Nor was this all. Formerly Dmitri Ivanovitch Nekhlyudov's occupations always made him feel vexed and irritable. Now they produced a joyful state of mind. The business at present occupying Nekhlyudov could be divided under three headings. He himself, with his usual pedantry, divided it in that way, and accordingly kept the papers referring to it in three different portfolios. The first referred to Maslova, and was chiefly that of taking steps to get her petition to the Emperor attended to, and preparing for her probable journey to Siberia. The second was about his estates. In Panovo he had given the land to the peasants on condition of their paying rent to be put to their own communal use, but he had to confirm this transaction by a legal deed, and to make his will in accordance with it. In Kousminski the state of things was still as he had first arranged it, i.e., he was to receive the rent, but the terms had to be fixed, and also how much of the money he would use to live on, and how much he would leave for the peasants' use. As he did not know what his journey to Siberia would cost him, he could not decide to lose this revenue altogether, though he reduced the income from it by half. The third part of his business was to help the convicts, who applied more and more often to him. At first, when he came in contact with the prisoners, and they appealed to him for help, he at once began interceding for them, hoping to lighten their fate. But he soon had so many applications that he felt the impossibility of attending to all of them, and that naturally led him to take up another piece of work, which at last roused his interest even more than the three first. This new part of his business was finding an answer to the following questions. What was this astonishing institution called criminal law, of which the results were that in the prison, with some of the inmates of which he had lately become acquainted, and in all those other places of confinement, from the Peter and Paul fortress in Petersburg to the island of Sakhalin, hundreds and thousands of victims were pining. What did this strange criminal law exist for? How had it originated? From his personal relations with the prisoners, from notes by some of those in confinement, and by questioning the advocate and the prison priest, Nekhlyudov came to the conclusion that the convicts, the so-called criminals, could be divided into 5 classes. The first were quite innocent people, condemned by judicial blunder. Such were the Menshovs, supposed to be incendiaries, Maslova, and others. There were not many of these, according to the priest's words, only 7%. but their condition excited particular interest. To the second class belong persons condemned for actions done under peculiar circumstances, i.e., in a fit of passion, jealousy, or drunkenness, circumstances under which those who judged them would surely have committed the same actions. The third class consisted of people punished for having committed actions which, according to their understanding, were quite natural and even good, but which those other people, the men who made the laws, considered to be crimes. Such were the persons who sold spirits without a license, smugglers, those who gathered grass and wood on large estates and in the forest belonging to the crown, the thieving miners, and those unbelieving people who robbed churches. To the fourth class belonged those who were imprisoned only because they stood morally higher than the average level of society. Such were the sectarians, the Poles, the Circassians, rebelling in order to regain their independence, the political prisoners, the socialists, the strikers condemned for withstanding the authorities. There was, according to Nekhlyudov's observations, a very large percentage belonging to this class, among them some of the best of men. The fifth class consisted of persons who had been far more sinned against by society than they had sinned against it. These were castaways, stupefied by continual oppression and temptation, such as the boy who had stolen the rugs, and hundreds of others whom Nekhlyudov had seen in the prison and out of it. The conditions under which they lived seemed to lead on systematically to those actions which are termed crimes. A great many thieves and murderers with whom he had lately come in contact, according to Nekhlyudov's estimate, belonged to this class. To this class Nekhlyudov also reckoned those depraved, demoralized creatures whom the new school of criminology classify as the criminal type, and the existence of which is considered to be the chief proof of the necessity of criminal law and punishment. This demoralized, depraved, abnormal type was, according to Nekhlyudov, exactly the same as that against whom society had sinned, only here society had sinned not directly against them, but against their parents and forefathers. Among this latter class Nekhlyudov was specially struck by one Okotin, an inveterate thief, the illegitimate son of a prostitute, brought up in a doss house, who, up to the age of 30, had apparently never met with anyone whose morality was above that of a policeman, and who had got into a band of thieves when quite young. He was gifted with an extraordinary sense of humour, by means of which he made himself very attractive. He asked Nekhlyudov for protection, at the same time making fun of himself, the lawyers, the prison, and laws human and divine. Another was the handsome Fedorov, who, with a band of robbers, of whom he was the chief, had robbed and murdered an old man, an official. Fedorov was a peasant, whose father had been unlawfully deprived of his house, and who, later on, when serving as a soldier, had suffered much because he had fallen in love with an officer's mistress. He had a fascinating, passionate nature that longed for enjoyment at any cost. He had never met anybody who restrained himself for any cause whatever, and had never heard a word about any aim in life other than enjoyment. Nekhlyudov distinctly saw that both these men were richly endowed by nature, but had been neglected and crippled like uncared-for plants. He had also met a tramp and a woman who had repelled him by their dullness and seeming cruelty. But even in them he could find no trace of the criminal type written about by the Italian school, but only saw in them people who were repulsive to him personally, just in the same way as some he had met outside the prison, in swallow-tail coats wearing epaulets or bedecked with lace. And so the investigation of the reasons why all these very different persons were put in prison, while others just like them were going about free and even judging them, formed a fourth task for Nekhlyudov. He hoped to find an answer to this question in books, and bought all that referred to it. He got the works of Lombroso, Garofalo, Ferry, Liszt, Maudsley, Tard, and read them carefully. But as he read he became more and more disappointed. It happened to him as it always happens to those who turn to science not in order to play a part in it, nor to write, nor to dispute, nor to teach, but simply for an answer to an everyday question of life. Science answered thousands of different, very subtle and ingenious questions touching criminal law, but not the one he was trying to solve. He asked a very simple question: why, and with what right, do some people lock up, torment, exile, flog, and kill others, while they are themselves just like those whom they torment, flog, and kill? And in answer he got deliberations as to whether human beings had free will or not, whether signs of criminality could be detected by measuring the skulls or not, what part heredity played in crime, whether immorality could be inherited, what madness is, what degeneration is, and what temperament is, how climate, food, ignorance, imitativeness, hypnotism, or passion act, what society is, what are its duties, etc., etc. These disquisitions reminded him of the answer he once got from a little boy whom he met coming home from school. Nekhlyudov asked him if he had learned his spelling. "I have," answered the boy. "Well, then, tell me, how do you spell leg?" "A dog's leg, or what kind of leg?" the boy answered, with a sly look. Answers in the form of new questions, like the boy's, was all that Nekhlyudov got in reply to his one primary question. He found much that was clever, learned much that was interesting, but what he did not find was an answer to the principal question: by what right some people punish others. Not only did he not find any answer, but all the arguments were brought forward in order to explain and vindicate punishment, the necessity of which was taken as an axiom. Nekhlyudov read much, but only in snatches, and putting down his failure to this superficial way of reading, hoped to find the answer later on. He would not allow himself to believe in the truth of the answer which began more and more often to present itself to him. End of Book 2, Chapter 30. By Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 31. Nekhlyudov's sister and her husband. The gang of prisoners, with Maslova among them, was to start on the 5th of July. Nekhlyudov arranged to start on the same day. The day before, Nekhlyudov's sister and her husband came to town to see him. Nekhlyudov's sister, Natalie Ivanovna Rogozinsky, was 10 years older than her brother. She had been very fond of him when he was a boy, and later on, just before her marriage, they grew very close to each other, as if they were equals, she being a young woman of 25, he a lad of 15. At that time she was in love with his friend, Nikolenka Irteniev, since dead. They both loved Nikolenka, and loved in him and in themselves that which is good and which unites all men. Since then they had both been depraved, he by military service and a vicious life, she by marriage with a man whom she loved with a sensual love, who did not care for the things that had once been so dear and holy to her and to her brother, nor even understand the meaning of those aspirations towards moral perfection and the service of mankind which once constituted her life, and put them down to ambition and the wish to show off, that being the only explanation comprehensible to him. Natalie's husband had been a man without a name and without means, but cleverly steering towards liberalism or conservatism, according to which best suited his purpose, he managed to make a comparatively brilliant judicial career. Some peculiarity which made him attractive to women assisted him when he was no longer in his first youth. While travelling abroad he made Nekhlyudov's acquaintance and managed to make Natalie, who was also no longer a girl, fall in love with him, rather against her mother's wishes, who considered a marriage with him to be a misalliance for her daughter. Nekhludoff, though he tried to hide it from himself, though he fought against it, hated his brother-in-law. Nekhludoff had a strong antipathy towards him because of the vulgarity of his feelings, his assurance and narrowness, but chiefly because of Nathalie, who managed to love him in spite of the narrowness of his nature, and loved him so selfishly, so sensually, and stifled for his sake all the good that had been in her. It always hurt Nekhludoff to think of Nathalie as the wife of that hairy, self-assured man with the shiny bald patch on his head. He could not even master a feeling of revulsion toward their children, and when he heard that she was again going to have a baby, he felt something like sorrow that she had once more been infected with something bad by this man who was so foreign to him. The Rogozhinskys had come to Moscow alone, having left their 2 children, a boy and a girl, at home, and stopped in the best rooms of the best hotel. Nathalie at once went to her mother's old house, but hearing from Agrafena Petrovna that her brother had left and was living in a lodging-house, she drove there. The dirty servant met her in the stuffy passage, dark but for a lamp which burnt there all day. He told her that the Prince was not in. Nathalie asked to be shown into his rooms, as she wished to leave a note for him, and the man took her up. Nathalie carefully examined her brother's 2 little rooms. She noticed in everything the love of cleanliness and order she knew so well in him, and was struck by the novel simplicity of the surroundings. On his writing table she saw the paperweight, with a bronze dog on the top, which she remembered. The tidy way in which his different portfolios and writing utensils were placed on the table was also familiar, and so was the large, crooked, ivory paper knife which marked the place in a French book by Tard, which lay with other volumes on punishment, and a book in English by Henry George. She sat down at the table and wrote a note asking him to be sure to come that same day, and shaking her head in surprise at what she saw, she returned to her hotel. 2 questions regarding her brother now interested Nathalie: his marriage with Katusha, which she had heard spoken about in their town, for everybody was speaking about it, and his giving away the land to the peasants, which was also known, and struck many as something of a political nature and dangerous. The marriage with Katusha pleased her in a way. She admired that resoluteness which was so like him and herself as they used to be in those happy times before her marriage. And yet she was horrified when she thought her brother was going to marry such a dreadful woman. The latter was the stronger feeling of the 2, and she decided to use all her influence to prevent him from doing it, though she knew how difficult this would be. The other matter, the giving up of the land to the peasants, did not touch her so nearly, but her husband was very indignant about it, and expected her to influence her brother against it. Rogozhinsky said that such an action was the height of inconsistency, flightiness, and pride, the only possible explanation of which was the desire to appear original, to brag, to make oneself talked about. What sense could there be in letting the land to the peasants on condition that they pay the rent to themselves? He said. If he was resolved to do such a thing, why not sell the land to them through the peasants' bank? There might have been some sense in that. In fact, this act verges on insanity. And Rogozhinsky began seriously thinking about putting Nekhludoff under guardianship, and demanded of his wife that she should speak seriously to her brother about his curious intention. End of Book 2, Chapter 31. By Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 32. Nekhludoff's Anarchism. As soon as Nekhludoff returned that evening and saw his sister's note on the table, he started to go and see her. He found Nathalie alone, her husband having gone to take a rest in the next room. She wore a tightly fitting black silk dress with a red bow in front. Her black hair was crimped and arranged according to the latest fashion. The pains she took to appear young for the sake of her husband, whose equal she was in years, were very obvious. When she saw her brother she jumped up and hurried towards him with her silk dress rustling. They kissed and looked smilingly at each other. There passed between them that mysterious exchange of looks, full of meaning, in which all was true and which cannot be expressed in words. Then came words which were not true. They had not met since their mother's death. "You have grown stouter and younger," he said, and her lips puckered up with pleasure. "And you have grown thinner." "Well, and how is your husband?" Nekhludoff asked. "He is taking a rest. He did not sleep all night." There was much to say, but it was not said in words. Only their looks expressed what their words failed to say. "I went to see you." "Yes, I know. I moved because the house is too big for me. I was lonely there and dull. I want nothing of all that is there, so that you had better take it all. The furniture, I mean, and things." "Yes, Agrafena Petrovna told me. I went there." "Thanks very much, but—" At this moment the hotel waiter brought in a silver tea set. While he set the table they were silent. Then Nathalie sat down at the table and made the tea, still in silence. Nekhludoff also said nothing. At last Nathalie began resolutely. "Well, Dmitri, I know all about it," and she looked at him. "What of that? I'm glad you know." "How can you hope to reform her after the life she has led?" she asked. He sat quite straight on a small chair and listened attentively, trying to understand her and to answer rightly. The state of mind called forth in him by his last interview with Maslova still filled his soul with quiet joy and goodwill to all men. "It is not her, but myself I wish to reform," he replied. Nathalie sighed. "There are other means besides marriage to do that." "But I think it is the best. Besides, it leads me into that world in which I can be of use." "I cannot believe you will be happy," said Nathalie. "It's not my happiness that is the point." "Of course, but if she has a heart she cannot be happy, cannot even wish it." "She does not wish it." "I understand. But life—" "Yes, life?" "Demands something different." "It demands nothing but that we should do what is right," said Nekhludoff, looking into her face, still handsome, though slightly wrinkled round eyes and mouth. "I do not understand," she said, and sighed. "Poor darling, how could she change so?" he thought, calling back to his mind Nathalie as she had been before her marriage, and feeling towards her a tenderness woven out of innumerable memories of childhood. At that moment Rogozhinsky entered the room with head thrown back and expanded chest, and stepping lightly and softly in his usual manner, his spectacles, his bald patch, and his black beard all glistening. "How do you do? How do you do?" he said, laying an unnatural and intentional stress on his words. Though soon after the marriage they had tried to be more familiar with each other, they had never succeeded. They shook hands, and Rogozhinsky sank softly into an easy chair. "Am I not interrupting your conversation?" "No, I do not wish to hide what I am saying or doing from anyone." As soon as Nekhludoff saw the hairy hands and heard the patronizing, self-assured tones, his meekness left him in a moment. "Yes, we were talking about his intentions," said Nathalie. "Shall I give you a cup of tea?" she added, taking the teapot. "Yes, please. What particular intentions do you mean?" "That of going to Siberia with the gang of prisoners, among whom is the woman I consider myself to have wronged," uttered Nekhludoff. "I hear not only to accompany her, but more than that." "Yes, and to marry her if she wishes it." "Dear me! But if you do not object, I should like to ask you to explain your motives. I do not understand them." "My motives are that this woman, that this woman's first step on her way to degradation. Nekhludoff got angry with himself and was unable to find the right expression. My motives are that I am the guilty one and she gets the punishment. If she is being punished, she cannot be innocent either. She is quite innocent, and Nekhludoff related the whole incident with unnecessary warmth. Yes, that was a case of carelessness on the part of the President, the result of which was a thoughtless answer on the part of the jury, but there is the Senate for cases like that. The Senate has rejected the appeal. Well, if the Senate has rejected it, there cannot have been sufficient reasons for an appeal, said Rogozhinsky, evidently sharing the prevailing opinion that truth is the product of judicial decrees. The Senate cannot enter into the question on its merits. If there is a real mistake, the Emperor should be petitioned. That has been done, but there is no probability of success. They will apply to the department of the Ministry, the department will consult the Senate will repeat its decision, and as usual the innocent will get punished. In the first place, the department of the Ministry won't consult the Senate, said Rogozhinsky with a condescending smile. It will give orders for the original deeds to be sent from the law court, and if it discovers a mistake it will decide accordingly. And secondly, the innocent are never punished, or at least in very rare exceptional cases it is the guilty who are punished, Rogozhinsky said deliberately, and smiled self-complacently. And I have become fully convinced that most of those condemned by law are innocent. How's that? Innocent in the literal sense, just as this woman is innocent of poisoning anyone, as innocent as a peasant I have just come to know of the murder he never committed, as a mother and son who were on the point of being condemned for incendiarism, which was committed by the owner of the house that was set on fire. Well, of course, there always have been and always will be judicial errors. Human institutions cannot be perfect. And besides, there are a great many people convicted who are innocent of doing anything considered wrong by the society they have grown up in. Excuse me, this is not so. Every thief knows that stealing is wrong and that we should not steal, that it is immoral, said Rogozhinsky, with his quiet, self-assured, slightly contemptuous smile, which specially irritated Nekhludoff. No, he does not know it. They say to him, don't steal, and he knows that the master of the factory steals his labour by keeping back his wages, that the government with its officials robs him continually by taxation. Why, this is anarchism, Rogozhinsky said, quietly defining his brother-in-law's words. I don't know what it is. I am only telling you the truth, Nekhludoff continued. He knows that the government is robbing him, knows that we landed proprietors have robbed him long since, robbed him of the land which should be the common property of all, and then, if he picks up dry wood to light his fire on that land stolen from him, we put him in jail and try to persuade him that he is a thief. Of course, he knows that not he, but those who robbed him of the land are thieves, and that to get any restitution of what has been robbed is his duty towards his family. I don't understand, or if I do, I cannot agree with it. The land must be somebody's property, began Rogozhinsky quietly, and convinced that Nekhludoff was a socialist, and that socialism demands that all the land should be divided equally, that such a division would be very foolish, and that he could easily prove it to be so, he said, if you divided it equally today, it would tomorrow be again in the hands of the most industrious and clever. Nobody is thinking of dividing the land equally. The land must not be anybody's property, must not be a thing to be bought and sold or rented. The rights of property are inborn in man. Without them the cultivation of land would present no interest. Destroy the rights of property and we lapse into barbarism. Rogozhinsky uttered this authoritatively, repeating the usual argument in favour of private ownership of land, which is supposed to be irrefutable, based on the assumption that people's desire to possess land proves that they need it. On the contrary, only when the land is nobody's property will it cease to lie idle as it does now, while the landlords, like dogs in the manger, unable themselves to put it to use, will not let those use it who are able." "But, Dmitri Ivanovitch, what you are saying is sheer madness. Is it possible to abolish property in our land, in our age? I know it is your old hobby, but allow me to tell you straight." And Rogozhinsky grew pale and his voice trembled. It was evident that this question touched him very nearly. "I should advise you to consider this question well before attempting to solve it practically." "Are you speaking of my personal affairs?" "Yes. I hold that we who are placed in special circumstances should bear the responsibilities which spring from those circumstances, should uphold the conditions in which we were born and which we have inherited from our predecessors, and which we ought to pass on to our descendants. I consider it my duty—" "Wait a bit," said Rogozhinsky, not permitting the interruption. "I am not speaking for myself or my children. The position of my children is assured, and I earn enough for us to live comfortably, and I expect my children will live so too, so that my interest in your action, which, if you will allow me to say so, is not well considered, is not based on personal motives. It is on principle that I cannot agree with you. I should advise you to think it well over, to read—" "Please allow me to settle my affairs, and to choose what to read and what not to read myself," said Nekhludoff, turning pale. Feeling his hands grow cold, and that he was no longer master of himself, he stopped and began drinking his tea. End of Book 2, Chapter 32. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 33. The Aim of the Law. "Well, and how are the children?" Nekhludoff asked his sister when he was calmer. The sister told him about the children. She said they were staying with their grandmother, their father's mother, and pleased that his dispute with her husband had come to an end, she began telling him how her children played that they were travelling, just as he used to do with his 3 dolls, one of them a negro and another which he called the French lady. "Can you really remember it all?" said Nekhludoff, smiling. "Yes, and just fancy, they play in the very same way." The unpleasant conversation had been brought to an end, and Nathalie was quieter, but she did not care to talk in her husband's presence of what could be comprehensible only to her brother. So, wishing to start a general conversation, she began talking about the sorrow of Kamensky's mother at losing her only son, who had fallen in a duel, for this Petersburg topic of the day had now reached Moscow. Rogozhinsky expressed disapproval at the state of things that excluded murder in a duel from the ordinary criminal offences. This remark evoked a rejoinder from Nekhludoff, and a new dispute arose on the subject. Nothing was fully explained. Neither of the antagonists expressed all he had in his mind, each keeping to his conviction, which condemned the other. Rogozhinsky felt that Nekhludoff condemned him and despised his activity, and he wished to show him the injustice of his opinions. Nekhludoff, on the other hand, felt provoked by his brother-in-law's interference in his affairs concerning the land, and knowing in his heart of hearts that his sister, her husband, and their children, as his heirs, had a right to do so, was indignant that this narrow-minded man persisted with calm assurance to regard as just and lawful what Nekhludoff no longer doubted was folly and crime. This man's arrogance annoyed Nekhludoff. "What could the law do?" he asked. "It could sentence one of the 2 duellists to the mines, like an ordinary murderer." Nekhludoff's hands grew cold. "Well, and what good would that be?" he asked hotly. "It would be just." "As if justice were the aim of the law," said Nekhludoff. "What else?" "The upholding of class interests. I think the law is only an instrument for upholding the existing order of things beneficial to our class." "This is a perfectly new view," said Rogozhinsky with a quiet smile. "The law is generally supposed to have a totally different aim." Yes, so it has in theory, but not in practice, as I have found out. The law aims only at preserving the present state of things, and therefore it persecutes and executes those who stand above the ordinary level and wish to raise it, the so-called political prisoners, as well as those who are below the average, the so-called criminal types. I do not agree with you. In the first place, I cannot admit that the criminals classed as political are punished because they are above the average. In most cases they are the refuse of society, just as much perverted, though in a different way, as the criminal types whom you consider below the average. But I happen to know men who are morally far above their judges. All the sectarians are moral from... But Rogozhinsky, a man not accustomed to be interrupted when he spoke, did not listen to Nekhlyudov, but went on talking at the same time, thereby irritating him still more. Nor can I admit that the object of the law is the upholding of the present state of things. The law aims at reforming, a nice kind of reform, in a prison, Nekhlyudov put in. Or removing, Rogozhinsky went on persistently, the perverted and brutalized persons that threaten society. That's just what it doesn't do. Society has not the means of doing either the one thing or the other. How is that? I don't understand, said Rogozhinsky with a forced smile. I mean that only two reasonable kinds of punishment exist. Those used in the old days, corporal and capital punishment, which, as human nature gradually softens, come more and more into disuse, said Nekhlyudov. There now, this is quite new and very strange to hear from your lips. Yes, it is reasonable to hurt a man so that he should not do in future what he is hurt for doing, and it is also quite reasonable to cut a man's head off when he is injurious or dangerous to society. These punishments have a reasonable meaning. But what sense is there in locking up in a prison a man perverted by want of occupation and bad example, to place him in a position where he is provided for, where laziness is imposed on him, and where he is in company with the most perverted of men? What reason is there to take a man at public cost, it comes to more than 500 roubles per head, from the Tula to the Irkutsk government, or from Kursk? Yes, but all the same, people are afraid of those journeys at public cost. And if it were not for such journeys and the prisons, you and I would not be sitting here as we are. The prisons cannot ensure our safety, because these people do not stay there forever, but are set free again. On the contrary, in those establishments men are brought to the greatest vice and degradation, so that the danger is increased. You mean to say that the penitentiary system should be improved? It cannot be improved. Improved prisons would cost more than all that is being now spent on the people's education, and would lay a still heavier burden on the people. The shortcomings of the penitentiary system in no wise invalidate the law itself, Rogozhinsky continued again, without heeding his brother-in-law. There is no remedy for these shortcomings, said Nekhlyudov, raising his voice. What of that? Shall we therefore go and kill, or, as a certain statesman proposed, go putting out people's eyes? Rogozhinsky remarked. Yes, that would be cruel, but it would be effective. What is done now is cruel, and not only ineffective, but so stupid that one cannot understand how people in their senses can take part in so absurd and cruel a business as criminal law. But I happen to take part in it, said Rogozhinsky, growing pale. That is your business, but to me it is incomprehensible. I think there are a good many things incomprehensible to you, said Rogozhinsky with a trembling voice. I have seen how one public prosecutor did his very best to get an unfortunate boy condemned, who could have evoked nothing but sympathy in an unperverted mind. I know how another cross-examined a sectarian and put down the reading of the Gospels as a criminal offence. In fact, the whole business of the law courts consists in senseless and cruel actions of that sort." "I should not serve if I thought so," said Rogozhinsky, rising. Nekhludoff noticed a peculiar glitter under his brother-in-law's spectacles. "Can it be tears?" he thought. And they were really tears of injured pride. Rogozhinsky went up to the window, got out his handkerchief, coughed and rubbed his spectacles, took them off and wiped his eyes. When he returned to the sofa he lit a cigar and did not speak any more. Nekhludoff felt pained and ashamed of having offended his brother-in-law and his sister to such a degree, especially as he was going away the next day. He parted with them in confusion and drove home. All I have said may be true. Anyhow, he did not reply, but it was not said in the right way. How little I must have changed if I could be carried away by ill feeling to such an extent as to hurt and wound poor Nathalie in such a way, he thought. End of Book 2, Chapter 33.
Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 34. The prisoners start for Siberia. The gang of prisoners, among whom was Maslova, was to leave Moscow by train at 3 p.m. Therefore, in order to see the gang start and walk to the station with the prisoners, Nekhludoff meant to reach the prison before 12 o'clock. The night before, as he was packing up and sorting his papers, he came upon his diary and read some bits here and there. The last bit, written before he left for Petersburg, ran thus: "Katusha does not wish to accept my sacrifice. She wishes to make a sacrifice herself. She has conquered, and so have I. She makes me happy by the inner change, which seems to me, though I fear to believe it, to be going on in her. I fear to believe it, yet she seems to be coming back to life." Then further on he read: "I have lived through something very hard and very joyful. I learnt that she has behaved very badly in the hospital, and I suddenly felt great pain. I never expected that it could be so painful. I spoke to her with loathing and hatred. Then all of a sudden I called to mind how many times I have been, and even still am, though but in thought, guilty of the thing that I hated her for, and immediately I became disgusting to myself, and pitied her and felt happy again. If only we could manage to see the beam in our own eye in time, how kind we should be." Then he wrote: "I have been to see Nathalie, and again self-satisfaction made me unkind and spiteful, and a heavy feeling remains. Well, what is to be done? To-morrow a new life will begin, a final good-bye to the old. Many new impressions have accumulated, but I cannot yet bring them to unity." When he awoke the next morning, Nekhludoff's first feeling was regret about the affair between him and his brother-in-law. "I cannot go away like this," he thought. "I must go and make it up with them." But when he looked at his watch, he saw that he had not time to go, but must hurry so as not to be too late for the departure of the gang. He hastily got everything ready, and sent the things to the station with a servant, and Taras, Theodosia's husband, who was going with them. Then he took the first isvostchik he could find, and drove off to the prison. The prisoners' train started 2 hours before the train by which he was going, so Nekhludoff paid his bill in the lodgings and left for good. It was July, and the weather was unbearably hot. From the stones, the walls, the iron of the roofs, which the sultry night had not cooled, the heat streamed into the motionless air. When at rare intervals a slight breeze did arise, it brought but a whiff of hot air filled with dust and smelling of oil paint. There were few people in the streets, and those who were out tried to keep on the shady side. Only the sunburnt peasants, with their bronzed faces and bark shoes on their feet, who were mending the road, sat hammering the stones into the burning sand in the sun, while the policemen, in their holland blouses, with revolvers fastened with orange cords, stood melancholy and depressed in the middle of the road, changing from foot to foot, and the tram-cars, the horses of which wore holland hoods on their heads, with slits for the ears, kept passing up and down the sunny road with ringing bells. When Nekhlyudov drove up to the prison, the gang had not left the yard. The work of delivering and receiving the prisoners that had commenced at 4 a.m. was still going on. The gang was to consist of 623 men and 64 women. They all had to be received according to the registry lists, the sick and the weak to be sorted out, and all to be delivered to the convoy. The new inspector, with 2 assistants, the doctor and medical assistant, the officer of the convoy, and the clerk, was sitting in the prison yard at a table covered with writing materials and papers, which was placed in the shade of a wall. They called the prisoners one by one, examined and questioned them, and took notes. The rays of the sun had gradually reached the table, and it was growing very hot and oppressive for want of air, and because of the breathing crowd of prisoners that stood close by. "Good gracious, will this never come to an end?" The convoy officer, a tall, fat, red-faced man with high shoulders, who kept puffing the smoke of his cigarette into his thick moustache, asked as he drew in a long puff. "You are killing me. From where have you got them all? Are there many more?" the clerk inquired. 24 men and the women. "What are you standing there for? Come on," shouted the convoy officer to the prisoners, who had not yet passed the revision, and who stood crowded one behind the other. The prisoners had been standing there more than 3 hours, packed in rows in the full sunlight, waiting their turns. While this was going on in the prison yard outside the gate, besides the sentinel who stood there as usual with a gun, were drawn up about 20 carts to carry the luggage of the prisoners and such prisoners as were too weak to walk, and a group of relatives and friends waiting to see the prisoners as they came out, and to exchange a few words if a chance presented itself, and to give them a few things. Nekhlyudov took his place among the group. He had stood there about an hour when the clanking of chains, the noise of footsteps, authoritative voices, the sound of coughing, and the low murmur of a large crowd became audible. This continued for about 5 minutes, during which several jailers went in and out of the gateway. At last the word of command was given. The gate opened with a thundering noise. The clattering of the chains became louder, and the convoy soldiers, dressed in white blouses and carrying guns, came out into the street and took their places in a large exact circle in front of the gate. This was evidently a usual, often practised manoeuvre. Then another command was given, and the prisoners began coming out in couples, with flat, pancake-shaped caps on their shaved heads and sacks over their shoulders, dragging their chained legs and swinging one arm, while the other held up a sack. First came the men condemned to hard labour, all dressed alike in grey trousers and cloaks with marks on the back. All of them, young and old, thin and fat, pale and red, dark and bearded and beardless, Russians, Tartars and Jews, came out, clattering with their chains and briskly swinging their arms as if prepared to go a long distance, but stopped after having taken 10 steps, and obediently took their places behind each other, 4 abreast. Then without interval streamed out more shaved men, dressed in the same manner, but with chains only on their legs. These were condemned to exile. They came out as briskly and stopped as suddenly, taking their places 4 in a row. Then came those exiled by their communes. Then the women in the same order, first those condemned to hard labour, with grey cloaks and kerchiefs. Then the exiled women, and those following their husbands of their own free will, dressed in their own town or village clothing. Some of the women were carrying babies wrapped in the fronts of their grey cloaks. With the women came the children, boys and girls, who, like colts in a herd of horses, pressed in among the prisoners. The men took their places silently, only coughing now and then, or making short remarks. The women talked without intermission. Nekhlyudov thought he saw Maslova as they were coming out, but she was at once lost in the large crowd, and he could only see grey creatures, seemingly devoid of all that was human, or at any rate of all that was womanly, with sacks on their backs and children round them, taking their places behind the men. Though all the prisoners had been counted inside the prison walls, the convoy counted them again, comparing the numbers with the list. This took very long, especially as some of the prisoners moved and changed places, which confused the convoy. The convoy soldiers shouted and pushed the prisoners, who complied obediently but angrily, and counted them over again. When all had been counted, the convoy officer gave a command, and the crowd became agitated. The weak men and women and children rushed, racing each other, towards the carts, and began placing their bags on the carts and climbing up themselves. Women with crying babies, merry children quarrelling for places, and dull, careworn prisoners got into the carts. Several of the prisoners took off their caps and came up to the convoy officer with some request. Nekhlyudov found out later that they were asking for places on the carts. Nekhlyudov saw how the officer, without looking at the prisoners, drew in a whiff from his cigarette, and then suddenly waved his short arm in front of one of the prisoners, who quickly drew his shaved head back between his shoulders, as if afraid of a blow, and sprang back. "I'll give you a lift such that you'll remember. You'll get there on foot right enough," shouted the officer. Only one of the men was granted his request, an old man with chains on his legs, and Nekhlyudov saw the old man take off his pancake-shaped cap and go up to the cart, crossing himself. He could not manage to get up on the cart because of the chains that prevented him lifting his old legs, and a woman who was sitting in the cart at last pulled him in by the arm. When all the sacks were in the carts, and those who were allowed to get in were seated, the officer took off his cap, wiped his forehead, his bald head, and fat red neck, and crossed himself. "March!" commanded the officer. The soldiers' guns gave a click. The prisoners took off their caps and crossed themselves. Those who were seeing them off shouted something. The prisoners shouted in answer. A row arose among the women, and the gang, surrounded by the soldiers in their white blouses, moved forward, raising the dust with their chained feet. The soldiers went in front. Then came the convicts condemned to hard labour, clattering with their chains. Then the exiled and those exiled by the communes, chained in couples by their wrists. Then the women. After them, on the carts loaded with sacks, came the weak. High up on one of the carts sat a woman closely wrapped up, and she kept shrieking and sobbing. End of Book 2, Chapter 34. Massachusetts. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 35. Not men, but strange and terrible creatures. The procession was such a long one that the carts with the luggage and the weak started only when those in front were already out of sight. When the last of the carts moved, Nekhlyudov got into the trap that stood waiting for him, and told the izvozchik to catch up to the prisoners in front, so that he could see if he knew any of the men in the gang, and then try and find out Maslova among the women, and ask her if she had received the things he sent. It was very hot, and a cloud of dust that was raised by the 1,000 tramping feet stood all the time over the gang that was moving down the middle of the street. The prisoners were walking quickly, and the slow-going izvozchik's horse was some time in catching them up. Row upon row they passed, those strange and terrible-looking creatures, none of whom Nekhludoff knew. On they went, all dressed alike, moving 1,000 feet all shod alike, swinging their free arms as if to keep up their spirits. There were so many of them, they all looked so much alike, and they were all placed in such unusual, peculiar circumstances, that they seemed to Nekhludoff to be not men, but some sort of strange and terrible creatures. This impression passed when he recognized in the crowd of convicts the murderer Fedorov, and among the exiles Okhotin, the wit, and another tramp who had appealed to him for assistance. Almost all the prisoners turned and looked at the trap that was passing them, and at the gentleman inside. Fedorov tossed his head backwards, as a sign that he had recognized Nekhludoff. Okhotin winked, but neither of them bowed, considering it not the thing. As soon as Nekhludoff came up to the women he saw Maslova. She was in the second row. The first in the row was a short-legged, black-eyed, hideous woman who had her cloak tucked up in her girdle. This was Khoroshavka. The next was a pregnant woman who dragged herself along with difficulty. The third was Maslova. She was carrying her sack on her shoulder and looked straight before her. Her face looked calm and determined. The fourth in the row was a young, lovely woman who was walking along briskly, dressed in a short cloak, her kerchief tied in peasant fashion. This was Theodosia. Nekhludoff got down and approached the women, meaning to ask Maslova if she had got the things he had sent her, and how she was feeling, but the convoy sergeant, who was walking on that side, noticed him at once and ran towards him. "You must not do that, sir. It is against the regulations to approach the gang," shouted the sergeant as he came up. But when he recognized Nekhludoff, every one in the prison knew Nekhludoff, the sergeant raised his fingers to his cap, and stopping in front of Nekhludoff said, "Not now. Wait till we get to the railway station. Here it is not allowed. Don't lag behind. March!" he shouted to the convicts, and putting on a brisk air, he ran back to his place at a trot, in spite of the heat and the elegant new boots on his feet. Nekhludoff went on to the pavement and told the isvostchik to follow him, himself walking so as to keep the convicts in sight. Wherever the gang passed it attracted attention mixed with horror and compassion. Those who drove past leaned out of the vehicles and followed the prisoners with their eyes. Those on foot stopped and looked with fear and surprise at the terrible sight. Some came up and gave alms to the prisoners. The alms were received by the convoy. Some, as if they were hypnotized, followed the gang, but then stopped, shook their heads, and followed the prisoners only with their eyes. Everywhere the people came out of the gates and doors, and called others to come out too, or leaned out of the windows looking, silent and immovable, at the frightful procession. At a crossroad a fine carriage was stopped by the gang. A fat coachman, with a shiny face and 2 rows of buttons on his back, sat on the box. A married couple sat facing the horses, the wife a pale thin woman, with a light-coloured bonnet on her head and a bright sunshade in her hand, the husband with a top hat and a well-cut, light-coloured overcoat. On the seat in front sat their children, a well-dressed little girl with loose fair hair and as fresh as a flower, who also held a bright parasol, and an 8-year-old boy with a long thin neck and sharp collar-bones, a sailor hat with long ribbons on his head. The father was angrily scolding the coachman because he had not passed in front of the gang when he had a chance, and the mother frowned and half closed her eyes with a look of disgust, shielding herself from the dust and the sun with her silk sunshade, which she held close to her face. The fat coachman frowned angrily at the unjust rebukes of his master, who had himself given the order to drive along that street, and with difficulty held in the glossy black horses, foaming under their harness and impatient to go on. The policeman wished with all his soul to please the owner of the fine equipage by stopping the gang, yet felt that the dismal solemnity of the procession could not be broken even for so rich a gentleman. He only raised his fingers to his cap to show his respect for riches, and looked severely at the prisoners, as if promising in any case to protect the owners of the carriage from them. So the carriage had to wait till the whole of the procession had passed, and could only move on when the last of the carts, laden with sacks and prisoners, rattled by. The hysterical woman who had sat on one of the carts, and had grown calm, again began shrieking and sobbing when she saw the elegant carriage. Then the coachman tightened the reins with a slight touch, and the black trotters, their shoes ringing against the paving stones, drew the carriage, softly swaying on its rubber tires, towards the country house, where the husband, the wife, the girl, and the boy with the sharp collarbones were going to amuse themselves. Neither the father nor the mother gave the girl and boy any explanation of what they had seen, so that the children had themselves to find out the meaning of this curious sight. The girl, taking the expression of her father's and mother's faces into consideration, solved the problem by assuming that these people were quite another kind of men and women than her father and mother and their acquaintances, that they were bad people, and that they had therefore to be treated in the manner they were being treated. Therefore the girl felt nothing but fear, and was glad when she could no longer see those people. But the boy with the long thin neck, who looked at the procession of prisoners without taking his eyes off them, solved the question differently. He still knew, firmly and without any doubt, for he had it from God, that these people were just the same kind of people as he was, and like all other people, and therefore some one had done these people some wrong, something that ought not to have been done, and he was sorry for them, and felt no horror either of those who were shaved and chained, or of those who had shaved and chained them. And so the boy's lips pouted more and more, and he made greater and greater efforts not to cry, thinking it a shame to cry in such a case. End of Book 2, Chapter 35.
Louis Maud, Book 2, Chapter 36. The Tender Mercies of the Lord. Nekhlyudov kept up with the quick pace of the convicts. Though lightly clothed, he felt dreadfully hot, and it was hard to breathe in the stifling, motionless, burning air filled with dust. When he had walked about a quarter of a mile, he again got into the trap, but it felt still hotter in the middle of the street. He tried to recall last night's conversation with his brother-in-law, but the recollections no longer excited him as they had done in the morning. They were dulled by the impressions made by the starting and procession of the gang, and chiefly by the intolerable heat. On the pavement, in the shade of some trees overhanging a fence, he saw two schoolboys standing over a kneeling man who sold ices. One of the boys was already sucking a pink spoon and enjoying his ices. The other was waiting for a glass that was being filled with something yellowish. "Where could I get a drink?" Nekhlyudov asked, his izvoshchik feeling an insurmountable desire for some refreshment. "There is a good eating-house close by," the izvoshchik answered, and turning a corner, drove up to a door with a large signboard. The plump clerk, in a Russian shirt, who stood behind the counter, and the waiters in their once white clothing, who sat at the tables, there being hardly any customers, looked with curiosity at the unusual visitor, and offered him their services. Nekhlyudov asked for a bottle of seltzer water, and sat down some way from the window at a small table covered with a dirty cloth. Two men sat at another table with tea things and a white bottle in front of them, mopping their foreheads and calculating something in a friendly manner. One of them was dark and bald, and had just such a border of hair at the back as Rahinsky. This sight again reminded Nekhlyudov of yesterday's talk with his brother-in-law, and his wish to see him and Natalie. I shall hardly be able to do it before the train starts, he thought. I better write. He asked for paper, an envelope, and a stamp, and as he was sipping the cool effervescent water, he considered what he should say, but his thoughts wandered, and he could not manage to compose a letter. My dear Nathalie, I cannot go away with the heavy impression that yesterday's talk with your husband has left. He began. What next? Shall I ask him to forgive me what I said yesterday? But I only said what I felt, and he will think that I am taking it back. Besides, this interference of his in my private matters. No, I cannot. And again he felt hatred rising in his heart towards that man so foreign to him. He folded the unfinished letter and put it in his pocket, paid, went out, and again got into the trap to catch up the gang. It had grown still hotter. The stones and the wall seemed to be breathing out hot air. The pavement seemed to scorch the feet, and Nekhlyudov felt a burning sensation in his hand when he touched the lacquered splash-guard of his trap. The horse was jogging along at a wary trot, beating the uneven dusty road monotonously with his hoofs. The isvostchik kept falling into a doze. Nekhlyudov sat without thinking of anything. At the bottom of a street, in front of a large house, a group of people had collected, and a convoy soldier stood by. "What has happened?" Nekhlyudov asked of a porter. "Something the matter with a convict." Nekhlyudov got down and came up to the group. On the rough stones, where the pavement slanted down to the gutter, lay a broadly built, red-bearded, elderly convict, with his head lower than his feet, and very red in the face. He had a grey cloak and grey trousers on, and lay on his back with the palms of his freckled hands downwards, and at long intervals his broad, high chest heaved and he groaned, while his bloodshot eyes were fixed on the sky. By him stood a cross-looking policeman, a peddler, a postman, a clerk, an old woman with a parasol, and a short-haired boy with an empty basket. "They are weak, having been locked up in prison. They've got weak, and then they lead them through the most broiling heat," said the clerk, addressing Nekhlyudov, who had just come up. "He'll die, most likely," said the woman with the parasol, in a doleful tone. "His shirt should be untied," said the postman. The policeman began, with his thick, trembling fingers, clumsily to untie the tapes that fastened the shirt round the red, sinewy neck. He was evidently excited and confused, but still thought it was necessary to address the crowd. "What have you collected here for? It is hot enough without your keeping the wind off." "They should have been examined by a doctor, and the weak ones left behind," said the clerk, showing off his knowledge at the law. The policeman, having undone the tapes of the shirt, rose and looked round. "Move on, I tell you. It is not your business, is it? What's there to stare at?" he said, and turned to Nekhlyudov for sympathy, but not finding any in his face, he turned to the convoy soldier. But the soldier stood aside, examining the trodden-down heel of his boot, and was quite indifferent to the policeman's perplexity. "Those whose business it is don't care. Is it right to do men to death like this? A convict is a convict, but still he is a man." Indifferent voices were heard saying in the crowd. "Put his head up higher, and give him some water," said Nekhlyudov. "Water has been sent for," said the policeman, and taking the prisoner under the arms, he with difficulty pulled his body a little higher up. "What's this gathering here?" said a decided authoritative voice, and a police officer, with a wonderfully clean, shiny blouse, and still more shiny top boots, came up to the assembled crowd. "Move on. No standing about here," he shouted to the crowd, before he knew what had attracted it. When he came near and saw the dying convict, he made a sign of approval with his head, just as if he had quite expected it, and turning to the policeman said, "How is this?" The policeman said that, as a gang of prisoners was passing, one of the convicts had fallen down, and the convoy officer had ordered him to be left behind. "Well, that's all right. He must be taken to the police station. Call an isvostchik." "A porter has gone for one," said the policeman, with his fingers raised to his cap. The shopman began something about the heat. "It is your business, eh? Move on," said the police officer, and looked so severely at him that the clerk was silenced. "He ought to have a little water," said Nekhlyudov. The police officer looked severely at Nekhlyudov also, but said nothing. When the porter thought a mugful of water, he told the policeman to offer some to the convict. The policeman raised the drooping head and tried to pour a little water down the mouth, but the prisoner could not swallow it, and it ran down his beard, wetting his jacket and his coarse, dirty linen shirt. "Pour it on his head," ordered the officer, and the policeman took off the pancake-shaped cap and poured the water over the red curls of the bald part of the prisoner's head. His eyes opened wide, as if in fear, but his position remained unchanged. Streams of dirt trickled down his dusty face, but the mouth continued to gasp in the same regular way, and his whole body shook. "And what's this? Take this one," said the police officer, pointing to Nekhlyudov's isvostchik. "You there, drive up. I am engaged," said Izvoshchik, dismally, and without looking up. "It is my isvostchik, but take him. I will pay you," said Nekhlyudov, turning to the isvostchik. "Well, what are you waiting for?" shouted the officer. "Catch hold." The policeman, the porter, and the convoy soldier lifted the dying man and carried him to the trap, and put him on the seat, but he could not sit up. His head fell back, and the whole of his body glided off the seat. "Make him lie down," ordered the officer. "It is all right, your honor. I'll manage him like this," said the policeman, sitting down by the dying man, and clasping his strong right arm round the body under the arms. The convoy soldier lifted the stockingless feet in prison shoes and put them into the trap. The police officer looked around, and noticing the pancake-shaped hat of the convict, lifted it up and put it on the wet, drooping head. "Go on," he ordered. The isvostchik looked angrily around, shook his head, and, accompanied by the convoy soldier, drove back to the police station. The policeman, sitting behind the convict, kept dragging up the body that was continually sliding down from the seat, while the head swung from side to side. The convoy soldier, who was walking by the side of the trap, kept putting his legs in their place. Nekhlyudov followed the trap. End of Book 2, Chapter 36. Recording by Chris Caron. Spilled like water on the ground. The trap passed the fireman, who stood sentinel at the entrance. The headquarters of the fire brigade and the police stations are generally together in Moscow. Drove into the yard of the police station and stopped at one of the doors. In the yard, several firemen, with their sleeves tucked up, were washing some kind of cart and talking loudly. When the trap stopped, several policemen surrounded it, and taking the lifeless body of the convict under the arms, took him out of the trap, which creaked under him. The policeman who had brought the body got down, shook his numbed arm, took off his cap, and crossed himself. The body was carried through the door and up the stairs. Nekhlyudov followed. In the small dirty room where the body was taken, there stood 4 beds. On 2 of them sat a couple of sick men in dressing gowns, one with a crooked mouth, whose neck was bandaged, the other one in consumption. 2 of the beds were empty. The convict was laid on one of them. A little man, with glistening eyes and continually moving brows, with only his underclothes and stockings on, came up with quick, soft steps, looked at the convict, and then at Nekhlyudov, and burst into loud laughter. This was a madman who was being kept in the police hospital. "They wish to frighten me, but no, they won't succeed," he said. The policemen who carried the corpse were followed by a police officer and a medical assistant. The medical assistant came up to the body and touched the freckled hand, already growing cold, which, though still soft, was deadly pale. He held it for a moment and then let it go. It fell lifelessly on the stomach of the dead man. "He's ready," said the medical assistant, but evidently to be quite in order. He undid the wet brown shirt, and tossing back the curls from his ear, put it to the yellowish, broad, immovable chest of the convict. All were silent. The medical assistant raised himself again, shook his head, and touched with his fingers first one and then the other lid over the open, fixed blue eyes. I'm not frightened. I'm not frightened. The madame kept repeating these words, and spitting in the direction of the medical assistant. Well? Asked the police officer. Well, he must be put into the mortuary. Are you sure, mind? Said the police officer. It's time I should know, said the medical assistant, drawing the shirt over the body's chest. However, I will send for Matthew Ivanovitch. Let him have a look, Petrov, call him. And the medical assistant stepped away from the body. Take him to the mortuary, said the police officer, and then you must come into the office and sign, he added to the convoy soldier, who had not left the convict for a moment. Yes, sir, said the soldier. The policeman lifted his body and carried it down again. Nekhlyudov wished to follow, but madame kept him back. You are not in the plot. Well, then, give me a cigarette, he said. Nekhlyudov got out his cigarette case and gave him one. The madman, quickly moving his brows all the time, began relating how they tormented him by thought suggestion. Why, they are all against me, and torment and torture me through their mediums. I beg your pardon, said Nekhlyudov. Without listening any further, he left the room and went out into the yard, wishing to know where the body would be put. The policemen, with their burden, had already crossed the yard, and were coming to the door of a cellar. Nekhlyudov wished to go up to them, but the police officer stopped him. What do you want? Nothing. Nothing? Then go away. Nekhlyudov obeyed, and went back to his isvostchik, who was dozing. He awoke him, and they drove back towards the railway station. They had not made 100 steps when they met a cart accompanied by a convoy soldier with a gun. On the cart lay another convict, who was already dead. The convict lay on his back in the cart, his shaved head, from which the pancake-shaped cap had slid over the back-bearded face down to the nose, shaking and thumping at every jolt. The driver, in his heavy boots, walked by the side of the cart, holding the reins. A policeman followed on foot. Nekhlyudov touched his isvostchik's shoulder. Just look what they are doing, said the isvostchik, stopping his horse. Nekhlyudov got down, and following the cart, again passed his sentinel, and entered the gate of the police station. By this time the firemen had finished washing the cart, and a tall, bony man, the chief of the fire brigade, with a coloured band round his cap, stood in their place, and with his hands in his pockets was severely looking at a fat-necked, well-fed bay stallion that was being led up and down before him by a fireman. The stallion was lame on one of his 4 feet, and the chief of the firemen was angrily saying something to a veterinary who stood by. The police officer was also present. When he saw the cart, he went up to the convoy soldier. Where did you bring him from? He asked, shaking his head disapprovingly. From the Gorbatovskaya, answered the policeman. A prisoner? Asked the chief of the fire brigade. Yes, it's the second today. Well, I must say, they've got some queer arrangements, though of course it's a broiling day, said the chief of the fire brigade. Then, turning to the fireman who was leading the same stallion, he shouted, Put him into the corner stall, and as to you, you hound, I'll teach you how to cripple horses which are worth more than you are, you scoundrel. The dead man was taken from the cart by the policeman just in the same way as the first had been, and carried upstairs into the hospital. Nekhlyudov followed them as if he were hypnotized. What do you want? Asked one of the policemen, but Nekhlyudov did not answer, and followed where the body was being carried. The madman, sitting on a bed, was smoking greedily the cigarette Nekhlyudov had given him. Ah, you've come back, he said, and laughed. When he saw the body he made a face, and said, Again, I am sick of it. I am not a boy, am I, eh? And he turned to Nekhlyudov with a questioning smile. Nekhlyudov was looking at a dead man, whose face, which had been hidden by his cap, was now visible. This convict was as handsome in face and body as the other was hideous. He was a man in the full bloom of life, notwithstanding that he was disfigured by the half of his head being shaved. The straight, rather low forehead, raised a bit over the black, lifeless eyes, was very fine, and so, though Norse above the thin, black moustaches, there was a smile on the lips that were already growing blue. A small beard outlined the lower part of the face, and on the shaved side of the head a firm, well-shaped ear was visible. One could see what possibilities of a higher life had been destroyed in this man. The fine bones of his hands and shackled feet, the strong muscles of all his well-proportioned limbs, showed what a beautiful, strong, agile human animal this had been. As an animal merely he had been a far more perfect one of his kind than the bay stallion, about the laming of which the fireman was so angry. Yet he had been done to death, and no one was sorry for him as a man, nor was anyone sorry that so fine a working animal had perished. The only feeling evinced was that of annoyance because of the bother caused by the necessity of getting his body threatening putrefaction out of the way. The doctor and his assistant entered the hospital, accompanied by the inspector of the police station. The doctor was a thick-set man, dressed in pongee silk coat and trousers of the same material, closely fitting his muscular thighs. The inspector was a little fat fellow with a red face, round as a ball, which he made still broader by a habit he had of filling his cheeks with air, and slowly letting it out again. The doctor sat down on the bed by the side of the dead man, and touched the hands in the same way as his assistant had done, put his ear to the heart, rose and pulled his trousers straight. Could not be more dead, he said. The inspector filled his mouth with air, and slowly blew it out again. Which prison is he from? He asked the convoy soldier. The soldier told him, and reminded him of the chains of the dead man's feet. I'll have them taken off. We have got a smith about. The Lord be thanked, said the inspector, and blew up his cheeks again. He went towards the door, slowly letting out the air. Why has this happened? Nekhlyudov asked the doctor. The doctor looked at him through his spectacles. Why has that happened? Why, they die of sunstroke, you mean? This is why. They sit all through the winter, without exercise and without light, and suddenly they are taken out into the sunshine, and on a day like this, and they march in a crowd so that they get no air, and sunstroke is the result. Then why are they sent out? Oh, as to that, go and ask those who send them. But I may ask, who are you? I am a stranger. Ah, well, good afternoon. I have no time. The doctor was vexed. He gave his trousers a downward pull, and went towards the beds of the sick. Well, how are you getting on? He asked the pale man with the crooked mouth and bandaged neck. Meanwhile the madman sat on a bed, and having finished his cigarette, kept spitting in the direction of the doctor. Nekhlyudov went down into the yard and out of the gate, past the firemen's horses and the hens and the sentinel in his brass helmet, and got into the trap, the driver of which had again fallen asleep. End of Book 2, Chapter 37. Recording by Chris Caron, Ham Lake, Minnesota.
Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 38. The Convict Train. When Nekhlyudov came to the station, the prisoners were all seated in railway carriages with grated windows. Several persons, come to see them off, stood on the platform, but were not allowed to come up to the carriages. The convoy was much troubled that day. On the way from the prison to the station, besides the two Nekhlyudov had seen, 3 other prisoners had fallen and died of sunstroke. One was taken to the nearest police station, like the first 2, and the other 2 died at the railway station. In Moscow, in the beginning of the 8th decade of this century, 5 convicts died of sunstroke in one day on their way from the Buturki prison to the Nijni railway station. The convoy men were not troubled because 5 men who might have been alive died while in their charge. This did not trouble them, but they were concerned lest anything that the law required in such cases should be omitted. To convey the bodies to the places appointed, to deliver up their papers, to take them off the list to be conveyed to Nijni, all this was very troublesome, especially on so hot a day. It was this that occupied the convoy men, and before it could all be accomplished, Nekhlyudov and the others who asked for leave to go up to the carriages were not allowed to do so. Nekhlyudov, however, was soon allowed to go up, because he tipped the convoy sergeant. The sergeant let Nekhlyudov pass, but asked him to be quick and get his talk over before any of the authorities noticed. There were 15 carriages in all, and except one carriage for the officials, they were full of prisoners. As Nekhludoff passed the carriages he listened to what was going on in them. In all the carriages was heard the clanging of chains, the sound of bustle, mixed with loud and senseless language, but not a word was being said about their dead fellow prisoners. The talk was all about sacks, drinking water, and the choice of seats. Looking into one of the carriages, Nekhludoff saw convoy soldiers taking the manacles off the hands of the prisoners. The prisoners held out their arms, and one of the soldiers unlocked the manacles with a key and took them off, the other collected them. After he had passed all the other carriages, Nekhludoff came up to the women's carriages. From the second of these he heard a woman's groans. "Oh, oh, oh God! Oh, oh, oh God!" Nekhludoff passed this carriage and went up to a window of the third carriage, which a soldier pointed out to him. When he approached his face to the window he felt the hot air, filled with the smell of perspiration, coming out of it, and heard distinctly the shrill sound of women's voices. All the seats were filled with red, perspiring, loudly talking women dressed in prison cloaks and white jackets. Nekhludoff's face at the window attracted their attention. Those nearest ceased talking and drew closer. Maslova, in her white jacket and her head uncovered, sat by the opposite window. The white-skinned, smiling Theodosia sat a little nearer. When she recognized Nekhludoff, she nudged Maslova and pointed to the window. Maslova rose hurriedly, threw her kerchief over her black hair, and with a smile on her hot, red face, came up to the window and took hold of one of the bars. "Well, it is hot," she said with a glad smile. "Did you get the things?" "Yes, thank you." "Is there anything more you want?" asked Nekhludoff, while the air came out of the hot carriage as out of an oven. "I want nothing, thank you." "If we could get a drink?" said Theodosia. "Yes, if we could get a drink," repeated Maslova. "Why, have you not got any water?" "They put some in, but it is all gone." "Directly. I will ask one of the convoy men. Now, we shall not see each other till we get to Nijni." "Why, are you going?" said Maslova, as if she did not know it, and looked joyfully at Nekhludoff. "I am going by the next train." Maslova said nothing, but only sighed deeply. "Is it true, sir, that 12 convicts have been done to death?" said a severe-looking old prisoner with a deep voice like a man's. It was Korableva. "I did not hear of 12. I have seen 2," said Nekhludoff. "They say there were 12 they killed, and will nothing be done to them? Only think, the fiends!" "And have none of the women fallen ill?" Nekhludoff asked. "Women are stronger," said another of the prisoners, a short little woman, and laughed. "Only there's one that has taken it into her head to be delivered. There she goes," she said, pointing to the next carriage, whence proceeded the groans. "You ask if we want anything," said Maslova, trying to keep the smile of joy from her lips. "Could not this woman be left behind, suffering as she is? There now, if you would tell the authorities." "Yes, I will." "And one thing more. Could she not see her husband, Taras?" she added, pointing with her eyes to the smiling Theodosia. "He is going with you, is he not?" "Sir, you must not talk," said a convoy sergeant, not the one who had let Nekhludoff come up. Nekhludoff left the carriage and went in search of an official to whom he might speak for the woman in travail and about Taras, but could not find him, nor get an answer from any of the convoy for a long time. They were all in a bustle. Some were leading a prisoner somewhere or other, others running to get themselves provisions. Some were placing their things in the carriages or attending on a lady who was going to accompany the convoy officer, and they answered Nekhludoff's questions unwillingly. Nekhludoff found the convoy officer only after the second bell had been rung. The officer, with his short arm, was wiping the moustaches that covered his mouth and shrugging his shoulders, reproving the corporal for something or other. "What is it you want?" he asked Nekhludoff. "You've got a woman there who is being confined, so I thought best." "Well, let her be confined. We shall see later on." And briskly swinging his short arms, he ran up to his carriage. At the moment the guard passed with a whistle in his hand, and from the people on the platform and from the women's carriages there arose a sound of weeping and words of prayer. Nekhludoff stood on the platform by the side of Taras and looked how, one after the other, the carriages glided past him, with the shaved heads of the men at the grated windows. Then the first of the women's carriages came up, with women's heads at the windows, some covered with kerchiefs and some uncovered. Then the second, whence proceeded the same groans. Then the carriage where Maslova was. She stood with the others at the window and looked at Nekhludoff with a pathetic smile. End of Book 2, Chapter 38. By Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 39. Brother and Sister. There were still 2 hours before the passenger train by which Nekhludoff was going would start. He had thought of using this interval to see his sister again, but after the impressions of the morning he felt much excited and so done up that, sitting down on the sofa in the first-class refreshment room, he suddenly grew so drowsy that he turned over onto his side and, laying his face on his hand, fell asleep at once. A waiter in a dress coat with a napkin in his hand woke him. "Sir, are you not Prince Nekhludoff? There's a lady looking for you." Nekhludoff started up and recollected where he was and all that had happened in the morning. He saw in his imagination the procession of prisoners, the dead bodies, the railway carriages with barred windows, and the women locked up in them, one of whom was groaning in travail with no one to help her, and another who was pathetically smiling at him through the bars. The reality before his eyes was very different, i.e., a table with vases, candlesticks and crockery, and agile waiters moving round the table, and in the background a cupboard and a counter laden with fruit and bottles, behind it a barman, and in front the backs of passengers who had come up for refreshments. When Nekhludoff had risen and sat gradually collecting his thoughts, he noticed that everybody in the room was inquisitively looking at something that was passing by the open doors. He also looked and saw a group of people carrying a chair on which sat a lady whose head was wrapped in a kind of airy fabric. Nekhludoff thought he knew the footman who was supporting the chair in front, and also the man behind, and a doorkeeper with gold cord on his cap seemed familiar. A lady's maid with a fringe and an apron, who was carrying a parcel, a parasol, and something round in a leather case, was walking behind the chair. Then came Prince Korchagin, with his thick lips, apoplectic neck, and a travelling cap on his head. Behind him Missy, her cousin Misha, and an acquaintance of Nekhludoff's, the long-necked diplomat Osten, with his protruding Adam's apple and his unvarying merry mood and expression. He was saying something very emphatically, though jokingly, to the smiling Missy. The Korchagins were moving from their estate near the city to the estate of the Princess's sister on the Nijni railway. The procession, the men carrying the chair, the maid, and the doctor, vanished into the ladies' waiting room, evoking a feeling of curiosity and respect in the onlookers. But the old prince remained and sat down at the table, called a waiter and ordered food and drink. Missy and Osten also remained in the refreshment room and were about to sit down when they saw an acquaintance in the doorway and went up to her. It was Natalie Rogozinsky. Natalie came into the refreshment room, accompanied by Agrafena Petrovna, and both looked round the room. Natalie noticed at one and the same moment both her brother and Missy. She first went up to Missy, only nodding to her brother, but having kissed her, at once turned to him. "At last I have found you," she said. Nekhludoff rose to greet Missy, Misha, and Osten, and to say a few words to them. Missy told him about their house in the country having been burnt down, which necessitated their moving to her aunt's. Osten began relating a funny story about a fire. Nekhludoff paid no attention and turned to his sister. "How glad I am that you have come." "I have been here a long time," she said. "Agrafena Petrovna is with me," and she pointed to Agrafena Petrovna, who, in a waterproof and with a bonnet on her head, stood some way off, and bowed to him with kindly dignity and some confusion, not wishing to intrude. "We looked for you everywhere." "And I had fallen asleep here. How glad I am that you have come," repeated Nekhludoff. "I had begun to write to you." "Really?" she said, looking frightened. "What about?" Missy and the gentleman, noticing that an intimate conversation was about to commence between the brother and sister, went away. Nekhludoff and his sister sat down by the window on a velvet-covered sofa, on which lay a plaid, a box, and a few other things. "Yesterday, after I left you, I felt inclined to return and express my regret, but I did not know how he would take it," said Nekhludoff. "I spoke hastily to your husband, and this tormented me." "I knew," said his sister, "that you did not mean to. Oh, you know," and the tears came to her eyes, and she touched his hand. The sentence was not clear, but he understood it perfectly, and was touched by what it expressed. Her words meant that, besides the love for her husband, which held her in its sway, she prized and considered important the love she had for him, her brother, and that every misunderstanding between them caused her deep suffering. "Thank you, thank you. Oh, what I have seen to day!" he said, suddenly recalling the second of the dead convicts. "Two prisoners have been done to death." "Done to death? How?" "Yes, done to death. They led them in this heat, and two died of sunstroke." "Impossible! What, to day? Just now?" "Yes, just now. I have seen their bodies." "But why done to death? Who killed them?" asked Nathalie. "They who forced them to go killed them," said Nekhludoff with irritation, feeling that she looked at this too with her husband's eyes. "Oh, Lord!" said Agrafena Petrovna, who had come up to them. "Yes, we have not the slightest idea of what is being done to these unfortunate beings, but it ought to be known," added Nekhludoff, and looked at old Korchagin, who sat with a napkin tied round him and a bottle before him, and who looked round at Nekhludoff. "Nekhludoff," he called out, "won't you join me and take some refreshment? It is excellent before a journey." Nekhludoff refused and turned away. "But what are you going to do?" Nathalie continued. "What I can. I don't know, but I feel I must do something, and I shall do what I am able to." "Yes, I understand. And how about them?" she continued, with a smile and a look towards Korchagin. "Is it possible that it is all over?" "Completely, and I think without any regret on either side." "It is a pity. I am sorry. I am fond of her. However, it's all right. But why do you wish to bind yourself?" she added shyly. "Why are you going?" "I go because I must," answered Nekhludoff seriously and dryly, as if wishing to stop this conversation. But he felt ashamed of his coldness towards his sister at once. "Why not tell her all I am thinking?" he thought, "and let Agrafena Petrovna also hear it," he thought, with a look at the old servant, whose presence made the wish to repeat his decision to his sister even stronger. "You mean my intention to marry Katusha? Well, you see, I made up my mind to do it, but she refuses, definitely and firmly," he said, and his voice shook, as it always did when he spoke of it. "She does not wish to accept my sacrifice, but is herself sacrificing what in her position means much. and I cannot accept this sacrifice, if it is only a momentary impulse. And so I am going with her, and shall be where she is, and shall try to lighten her fate as much as I can." Nathalie said nothing. Agrafena Petrovna looked at her with a questioning look and shook her head. At this moment the former procession issued from the ladies' room. The same handsome footman, Philip, and the doorkeeper were carrying the Princess Korchagin. She stopped the men who were carrying her and motioned to Nekhludoff to approach, and with a pitiful, languishing air she extended her white ringed hand, expecting the firm pressure of his hand with a sense of horror. "Épouvantable!" she said, meaning the heat. "I cannot stand it. Ce climat me tue." And after a short talk about the horrors of the Russian climate, she gave the men a sign to go on. "Be sure and come," she added, turning her long face towards Nekhludoff as she was borne away. The procession with the princes turned to the right towards the first-class carriages. Nekhludoff, with the porter who was carrying his things, and Taras with his bag, turned to the left. "This is my companion," said Nekhludoff to his sister, pointing to Taras, whose story he had told her before. "Surely not third class?" said Nathalie, when Nekhludoff stopped in front of the third-class carriage, and Taras and the porter with the things went in. "Yes, it is more convenient for me to be with Taras," he said. "One more thing," he added. "Up to now I have not given the Kousminski land to the peasants, so that, in case of my death, your children will inherit it." "Dmitri, don't," said Nathalie. "If I do give it away, all I can say is that the rest will be theirs, as it is not likely I shall marry, and if I do marry I shall have no children, so that—" "Dmitri, don't talk like that," said Nathalie, and yet Nekhludoff noticed that she was glad to hear him say it. Higher up, by the side of a first-class carriage, there stood a group of people still looking at the carriage into which the Princess Korchagin had been carried. Most of the passengers were already seated. Some of the late-comers hurriedly clattered along the boards of the platform. The guard was closing the doors and asking the passengers to get in, and those who were seeing them off to come out. Nekhludoff entered the hot, smelling carriage, but at once stepped out again onto the small platform at the back of the carriage. Nathalie stood opposite the carriage, with her fashionable bonnet and cape, by the side of Agrafena Petrovna, and was evidently trying to find something to say. She could not even say écrivez, because they had long ago laughed at this word, habitually spoken by those about to part. The short conversation about money matters had in a moment destroyed the tender brotherly and sisterly feelings that had taken hold of them. They felt estranged, so that Nathalie was glad when the train moved, and she could only say, nodding her head with a sad and tender look, "Good-bye, good-bye, Dmitri." But as soon as the carriage had passed her, she thought of how she should repeat her conversation with her brother to her husband, and her face became serious and troubled. Nekhludoff, too, though he had nothing but the kindest feelings for his sister, and had hidden nothing from her, now felt depressed and uncomfortable with her, and was glad to part. He felt that the Nathalie who was once so near to him no longer existed, and in her place was only a slave of that hairy, unpleasant husband who was so foreign to him. He saw it clearly when her face lit up with peculiar animation as he spoke of what would peculiarly interest her husband, i.e., the giving up of the land to the peasants and the inheritance, and this made him sad. End of Book 2, Chapter 39. Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 40. The Fundamental Law of Human Life. The heat in the large third-class carriage, which had been standing in the burning sun all day, was so great that Nekhludoff did not go in, but stopped on the little platform behind the carriage, which formed a passage to the next one. But there was not a breath of fresh air here either, and Nekhludoff breathed freely only when the train had passed the buildings and the draught blew across the platform. Yes, killed, he repeated to himself the words he had used to his sister, and in his imagination, in the midst of all other impressions, there arose with wonderful clearness the beautiful face of the second dead convict, with the smile of the lips, the severe expression of the brows, and the small, firm ear below the shaved, bluish skull. And what seemed terrible was that he had been murdered, and no one knew who had murdered him. Yet he had been murdered. He was led out like all the rest of the prisoners by Maslenikov's orders. Maslennikoff had probably given the order in the usual manner, had signed with his stupid flourish the paper with the printed heading, and most certainly would not consider himself guilty. Still less would the careful doctor who examined the convicts consider himself guilty. He had performed his duty accurately and had separated the weak. How could he have foreseen this terrible heat, or the fact that they would start so late in the day and in such crowds? The prison inspector? But the inspector had only carried into execution the order that on a given day a certain number of exiles and convicts, men and women, had to be sent off. The convoy officer could not be guilty either, for his business was to receive a certain number of persons in a certain place, and to deliver up the same number. He conducted them in the usual manner, and could not foresee that two such strong men as those Nekhludoff saw would not be able to stand it and would die. No one is guilty, and yet the men have been murdered by these people who are not guilty of their murder. All this comes, Nekhludoff thought, from the fact that all these people, governors, inspectors, police officers, and men, consider that there are circumstances in which human relations are not necessary between human beings. All these men, Maslennikoff and the inspector and the convoy officer, if they were not governor, inspector, officer, would have considered 20 times before sending people in such heat, in such a mass, would have stopped 20 times on the way, and, seeing that a man was growing weak, gasping for breath, would have led him into the shade, would have given him water and let him rest, and if an accident had still occurred, they would have expressed pity. But they not only did not do it, but hindered others from doing it, because they considered not men and their duty toward them, but only the office they themselves filled, and held what that office demanded of them to be above human relations. That's what it is, Nekhludoff went on in his thoughts. If one acknowledges, but for a single hour, that anything can be more important than love for one's fellow men, even in some one exceptional case, any crime can be committed without a feeling of guilt. Nekhludoff was so engrossed by his thoughts that he did not notice how the weather changed. The sun was covered over by a low-hanging, ragged cloud. A compact, light grey cloud was rapidly coming from the west, and was already falling in heavy, driving rain on the fields and woods far in the distance. Moisture coming from the cloud mixed with the air. Now and then the cloud was rent by flashes of lightning, and peals of thunder mingled more and more often with the rattling of the train. The cloud came nearer and nearer. The raindrops, driven by the wind, began to spot the platform and Nekhludoff's coat, and he stepped to the other side of the little platform, and, inhaling the fresh, moist air, filled with the smell of corn and wet earth that had long been waiting for rain, he stood looking at the gardens, the woods, the yellow rye fields, the green oat fields, the dark green strips of potatoes in bloom that glided past. Everything looked as if covered over with varnish. The green turned greener, the yellow yellower, the black blacker. "More, more!" said Nekhludoff, gladdened by the sight of gardens and fields revived by the beneficent shower. The shower did not last long. Part of the cloud had come down in rain. Part passed over, and the last fine drops fell straight on to the earth. The sun reappeared. Everything began to glisten, and in the east, not very high above the horizon, appeared a bright rainbow, with the violet tint very distinct and broken only at one end. "Why, what was I thinking about?" Nekhludoff asked himself when all these changes in nature were over, and the train ran into a cutting between two high banks. "Oh, I was thinking that all those people, inspector, convoy men, all those in the service, are for the greater part kind people, cruel only because they are serving." He recalled Maslenikov's indifference when he told him about what was being done in the prison, the inspector's severity, the cruelty of the convoy officer when he refused places on the carts to those who asked for them, and paid no attention to the fact that there was a woman in travail in the train. All these people were evidently invulnerable and impregnable to the simplest feelings of compassion only because they held offices. As officials they were impermeable to the feelings of humanity as this paved ground is impermeable to the rain. Thus thought Nekhludoff as he looked at the railway embankment paved with stones of different colours, down which the water was running in streams instead of soaking into the earth. Perhaps it is necessary to pave the banks with stones, but it is sad to look at the ground, which might be yielding corn, grass, bushes, or trees in the same way as the ground visible up there is doing, deprived of vegetation, and so it is with men, thought Nekhludoff. Perhaps these governors, inspectors, policemen are needed, but it is terrible to see men deprived of the chief human attribute, that of love and sympathy for one another. The thing is, he continued, that these people consider lawful what is not lawful, and do not consider the eternal, immutable law written in the hearts of men by God as law. That is why I feel so depressed when I am with these people. I am simply afraid of them. And really they are terrible, more terrible than robbers. A robber might, after all, feel pity, but they can feel no pity. They are inured against pity as these stones are against vegetation. That is what makes them terrible. It is said that the Pugachevs, the Razins, leaders of rebellions in Russia, Stonka Razin in the 17th and Pugachev in the 18th century, are terrible. These are 1,000 times more terrible, he continued in his thoughts. If a psychological problem were set to find means of making men of our time, Christian, humane, simple, kind people, perform the most horrible crimes without feeling guilty, only one solution could be devised: to go on doing what is being done. It is only necessary that these people should be governors, inspectors, policemen, that they should be fully convinced that there is a kind of business called government service which allows men to treat other men as things without human brotherly relations with them, and also that these people should be so linked together by this government service that the responsibility for the results of their actions should not fall on any one of them separately. Without these conditions the terrible acts I witness today would be impossible in our times. It all lies in the fact that men think there are circumstances in which one may deal with human beings without love, and there are no such circumstances. One may deal with things without love. One may cut down trees, make bricks, hammer iron without love, but you cannot deal with men without it, just as one cannot deal with bees without being careful. If you deal carelessly with bees you will injure them, and will yourself be injured, and so with men. It cannot be otherwise, because natural love is the fundamental law of human life. It is true that a man cannot force another to love him, as he can force him to work for him, but it does not follow that a man may deal with men without love, especially to demand anything from them. If you feel no love, sit still, Nekhludoff thought. Occupy yourself with things, with yourself, with anything you like, only not with men. You can only eat without injuring yourself when you feel inclined to eat. So you can only deal with men usefully when you love. Only let yourself deal with a man without love, as I did yesterday with my brother-in-law, and there are no limits to the suffering you will bring on yourself, as all my life proves. Yes, it is so, thought Nekhludoff. It is good, yes, it is good, he repeated, enjoying the freshness after the torturing heat, and conscious of having attained to the fullest clearness on a question that had long occupied him. End of Book 2, Chapter 40.
Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 41. Taras's Story. The carriage in which Nekhlyudov had taken his place was half filled with people. There were in it servants, working men, factory hands, butchers, Jews, shopmen, workmen's wives, a soldier, two ladies, a young one and an old one, with bracelets on her arm, and a severe-looking gentleman with a cockade on his black cap. All these people were sitting quietly. The bustle of taking their places was long over. Some sat cracking and eating sunflower seeds, some smoking, some talking. Taras sat, looking very happy, opposite the door, keeping a place for Nekhlyudov, and carrying on an animated conversation with a man in a cloth coat who sat opposite to him, and who was, as Nekhlyudov afterwards found out, a gardener going to a new situation. Before reaching the place where Taras sat, Nekhlyudov stopped between the seats, near a reverend-looking old man with a white beard and nankeen coat, who was talking with a young woman in peasant dress. A little girl of about 7, dressed in a new peasant costume, sat, her little legs dangling above the floor, by the side of the women, and kept cracking seeds. The old man turned round, and, seeing Nekhlyudov, he moved the lappets of his coat off the varnished seat next to him, and said, in a friendly manner, "Please, here's a seat." Nekhlyudov thanked him and took the seat. As soon as he was seated, the woman continued the interrupted conversation. She was returning to her village, and related how her husband, whom she had been visiting, had received her in town. "I was there during the carnival, and now, by the Lord's help, I've been again," she said. "Then, God willing, at Christmas I'll go again." "That's right," said the old man, with a look at Nekhlyudov. "It's the best way to go and see him, else a young man can easily go to the bad, living in a town." "Oh no, sir, mine is not such a man. No nonsense of any kind about him. His life is as good as a young maiden's. The money he earns he sends home, all to a kopeck. And as to our girl here, he was so glad to see her. There were no words for it," said the woman, and smiled. The little girl, who sat cracking her seeds and spitting out the shells, listened to her mother's words, and, as if to confirm them, looked up with calm, intelligent eyes into Nekhlyudov's and the old man's faces. "Well, if he's good, that's better still," said the old man. "And none of that sort of thing?" he added, with a look at a couple, evidently factory hands, who sat at the other side of the carriage. The husband, with his head thrown back, was pouring vodka down his throat out of a bottle, and the wife sat holding a bag, out of which they had taken the bottle, and watched him intently. "No, mine neither drinks nor smokes," said the woman, who was conversing with the old man, glad of the opportunity of praising her husband once more. "No, sir, the earth does not hold many such," and, turning to Nekhlyudov, she added, "That's the sort of man he is." "What could be better?" said the old man, looking at the factory worker, who had had his drink and had passed the bottle to his wife. The wife laughed, shook her head, and also raised the bottle to her lips. Noticing Nekhlyudov's and the old man's look directed towards them, the factory worker addressed the former. "What is it, sir, that we are drinking?" "Ah, no one sees how we work, but every one sees how we drink. I have earned it, and I am drinking, and treating my wife and no one else." "Yes, yes," said Nekhlyudov, not knowing what to say. "True, sir. My wife is a steady woman. I am satisfied with my wife, because she can feel for me. Is it right what I'm saying, Mavra?" "There you are, take it. I don't want any more," said the wife, returning the bottle to him. "And what are you jawing for like that?" she added. "There now, she's good, that good, and suddenly she'll begin squeaking like a wheel that's not greased. Mavra, is it right what I'm saying?" Mavra laughed and moved her hand with a tipsy gesture. "Oh my, he's at it again. There now, she's that good, that good. But let her get her tail over the reins, and you can't think what she'll be up to. Is it right what I'm saying?" "You must excuse me, sir. I've had a drop." "What's to be done?" said the factory worker, and, preparing to go to sleep, put his head in his wife's lap. Nekhlyudov sat a while with the old man, who told him all about himself. The old man was a stove builder, who had been working for 53 years, and had built so many stoves that he had lost count. And now he wanted to rest, but had no time. He had been to town and found employment for the young ones, and was now going to the country to see the people at home. After hearing the old man's story, Nekhlyudov went to the place that Taras was keeping for him. "It's all right, sir. Sit down, we'll put the bag here," said the gardener, who sat opposite Taras, in a friendly tone, looking up into Nekhlyudov's face. "Rather a tight fit, but no matter since we are friends," said Taras, smiling and lifting the bag, which weighed more than 5 stone. As if it were a feather, he carried it across to the window. "Plenty of room. Besides, we might stand up a bit, and even under the seat it's as comfortable as you could wish. What's the good of humbugging?" he said, beaming with friendliness and kindness. Taras spoke of himself as being unable to utter a word when quite sober, but drink, he said, helped him to find the right words, and then he could express everything. And in reality, when he was sober, Taras kept silent. But when he had been drinking, which happened rarely, and only on special occasions, he became very pleasantly talkative. Then he spoke a great deal, spoke well, and very simply and truthfully, and especially with great kindliness, which shone in his gentle blue eyes and in the friendly smile that never left his lips. He was in such a state today, Nekhlyudov's approach interrupted the conversation. But when he had put the bag in its place, Taras sat down again, and with his strong hands folded in his lap, and looking straight into the gardener's face, continued his story. He was telling his new acquaintance about his wife, and giving every detail. What she was being sent to Siberia for, and why he was now following her. Nekhlyudov had never heard a detailed account of this affair, and so he listened with interest. When he came up, the story had reached the point where the attempt to poison was already an accomplished fact, and the family had discovered that it was Theodosia's doing. "It's about my troubles that I'm talking," said Taras, addressing Nekhlyudov with cordial friendliness. "I have chanced to come across such a hearty man, and we've got into conversation, and I'm telling him all." "I see," said Nekhlyudov. "Well then, in this way, my friend, the business became known. Mother, she takes that cake. 'I'm going,' she says, 'to the police officer.' My father is a just old man. 'Wait, wife,' says he. The little woman is a mere child, and did not herself know what she was doing. We must have pity. She may come to her senses. But, dear me, mother would not hear of it. While we keep her here, she says, she may destroy us all like cockroaches. Well, friend, so she goes off to the police officer. He bounces in upon us at once, calls for witnesses." "Well, and you?" asked the gardener. "Well, I, you see, friend, roll about with a pain in my stomach and vomit. All my inside is turned inside out. I can't even speak. Well, so father, he goes and harnesses the mare, and puts Theodosia into the cart, and is off to the police station, and then to the magistrates. And she, you know, just as she had done from the first, So also there. Confesses all to the magistrate. Where she got the arsenic, and how she needed the cake. Why did you do it, says he. Why, says she, because he's hateful to me. I prefer Siberia to a life with him. That's me, and Taras smiled. Well, so she confessed all. Then, naturally, the prison, and father returns alone. And harvest time just coming, and mother the only woman at home, and she no longer strong. So we think what we are to do. Could we not bail her out? So father went to see an official. No go. Then another. I think he went to 5 of them, and we thought of giving it up. Then we happened to come across a clerk. Such an artful one as you don't often find. You give me 5 roubles and I'll get her out, says he. We agreed to do it for 3. Well, and what do you think, friend? I went and pawned the linen she herself had woven, and gave him the money. As soon as he had written that paper, drawled out Taras, just as he was speaking of a shot being fired, we succeeded at once. I went to fetch her myself. Well, friend, so I got to town, put up the mare, took the paper, and went to the prison. What do you want? This is what I want, say I. You've got my wife here in prison. And have you got a paper? I gave him the paper. He gave it a look. Wait, says he. So I sat down on a bench. It was already past noon by the sun. An official comes out. You are Vagusov? I am. Well, you may take her. The gates opened, and they led her out in her own clothes, quite all right. Well, come along. Have you come on foot? No, I have a horse here. So I went and paid the ostler, and harnessed, put in all the hay that was left, and covered it with sacking for her to sit on. She got in and wrapped her shawl round her, and off we drove. She says nothing, and I say nothing. Just as we were coming up to the house, she says, "And how's mother? Is she alive?" Yes, she's alive. And father, is he alive? Yes, he is. Forgive me, Taras, she says, for my folly. I did not myself know what I was doing. So I say, words won't mend matters. I have forgiven you long ago. And I said no more. We got home, and she just fell at mother's feet. Mother says, the Lord will forgive you. And father said, how do you do? And, what's past is past. Live as best you can. Now, says he, is not the time for all that. There's the harvest to be gathered in down at Skorodino, he says. Down on the manured acre, by the Lord's help, the ground has borne such rye that the sickle can't tackle it. It's all interwoven and heavy, and has sunk beneath its weight. That must be reaped. You and Taras had better go and see to it tomorrow. Well, friend, from that moment she took to the work, and worked so that every one wondered. At that time we rented 3 dessiatins, and by God's help we had a wonderful crop both of oats and rye. I mow and she binds the sheaves, and sometimes we both of us reap. I am good at work and not afraid of it, but she's better still at whatever she takes up. She's a smart woman, young and full of life. And as to work, friend, she'd grown that eager that I had to stop her. We get home, our fingers swollen, our arms aching, and she, instead of resting, rushes off to the barn to make binders for the sheaves for next day. Such a change. Well, and to you, was she kinder now? Asked the gardener. That's beyond question. She clings to me as if we were one soul. Whatever I think she understands. Even mother, angry as she was, could not help saying, it's as if our Theodosia had been transformed. She's quite a different woman now. We were once going to cart the sheaves with 2 carts. She and I were in the first, and I say, how could you think of doing that, Theodosia? And she says, how could I think of it? Just so. I did not wish to live with you. I thought I'd rather die than live with you. I say, and now? And she says, now you're in my heart. Taras stopped and smiled joyfully, shook his head as if surprised. Hardly had we got the harvest home when I went to soak the hemp, and when I got home there was a summons. She must go to be tried, and we had forgotten all about the matter that she was to be tried for. It can only be the evil one, said the gardener. Could any man of himself think of destroying a living soul? We had a fellow once, and the gardener was about to commence his tale when the train began to stop. It seems we are coming to a station, he said. I'll go and have a drink. The conversation stopped, and Nekhlyudov followed the gardener out of the carriage onto the wet platform of the station. End of Book 2, Chapter 41. Massachusetts. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud. Book 2, Chapter 42. Le Vrai Grand Monde. Before Nekhlyudov got out, he had noticed in the station yard several elegant equipages, some with 3, some with 4 well-fed horses, with tinkling bells on their harness. When he stepped out on the wet, dark-coloured boards of the platform, he saw a group of people in front of the first-class carriage, among whom were conspicuous a stout lady with costly feathers on her hat and a waterproof, and a tall, thin-legged young man in a cycling suit. The young man had by his side an enormous, well-fed dog with a valuable collar. Behind them stood footmen, holding wraps and umbrellas, and a coachman who had also come to meet the train. On the whole of the group, from the fat lady down to the coachman who stood holding up his long coat, there lay the stamp of wealth and quiet self-assurance. A curious and servile crowd rapidly gathered round this group. The station-master in his red cap, a gendarme, a thin young lady in Russian costume, with beads round her neck, who made a point of seeing the trains come in all through the summer, a telegraph clerk, and passengers, men and women. In the young man with the dog, Nekhlyudov recognized young Korchagin, a gymnasium student. The fat lady was the princess's sister, to whose estate the Korchagins were now moving. The guard, with his gold cord and shiny top boots, opened the carriage door and stood holding it as a sign of deference, while Philip and a porter with a white apron carefully carried out the long-faced princess in her folding chair. The sisters greeted each other, and French sentences began flying about. Would the princess go in a closed or an open carriage? At last the procession started towards the exit. The lady's maid, with her curly fringe, parasol and leather case in the rear. Nekhlyudov, not wishing to meet them and to have to take leave over again, stopped before he got to the door, waiting for the procession to pass. The princess, her son Missy, the doctor, and the maid went out first. The old prince and his sister-in-law remained behind. Nekhlyudov was too far to catch anything but a few disconnected French sentences of their conversation. One of the sentences uttered by the prince, as it often happens, for some unaccountable reason remained in his memory with all its intonations and the sound of the voice. "Oh, il est du vrai grand monde, du vrai grand monde," said the prince in his loud, self-assured tone, as he went out of the station with his sister-in-law, accompanied by the respectful guards and porters. At this moment, from behind the corner of the station, suddenly appeared a crowd of workmen in bark shoes, wearing sheepskin coats and carrying bags on their backs. The workmen went up to the nearest carriage with soft yet determined steps, and were about to get in, but were at once driven away by a guard. Without stopping, the workmen passed on, hurrying and jostling one another, to the next carriage and began getting in. catching their bags against the corners and door of the carriage, but another guard caught sight of them from the door of the station, and shouted at them severely. The workmen, who had already got in, hurried out again, and went on, with the same soft and firm steps, still further towards Nekhlyudov's carriage. A guard was again going to stop them, but Nekhlyudov said there was plenty of room inside, and that they had better get in. They obeyed and got in, followed by Nekhlyudov. The workmen were about to take their seats, when the gentleman with the cockade and the two ladies, looking at this attempt to settle in their carriage as a personal insult to themselves, indignantly protested and wanted to turn them out. The workmen, there were 20 of them, old men and quite young ones, all of them wearied, sunburnt, with haggard faces, began at once to move on through the carriage, catching the seats, the walls, and the doors with their bags. They evidently felt they had offended in some way, and seemed ready to go on indefinitely wherever they were ordered to go. "Where are you pushing to, you fiends? Sit down here," shouted another guard they met. "Voilà, encore des nouvelles!" exclaimed the younger of the two ladies, quite convinced that she would attract Nekhlyudov's notice by her good French. The other lady with the bracelets kept sniffing and making faces, and remarked something about how pleasant it was to sit with smelly peasants. The workmen, who had felt the joy and calm experienced by people who have escaped some kind of danger, threw off their heavy bags with a movement of their shoulders and stowed them under the seats. The gardener had left his own seat to talk with Taras, and now went back, so that there were 2 unoccupied seats opposite and one next to Taras. 3 of the workmen took these seats, but when Nekhlyudov came up to them, in his gentleman's clothing, they got so confused that they rose to go away, but Nekhlyudov asked them to stay, and himself sat down on the arm of the seat, by the passage down the middle of the carriage. One of the workmen, a man of about 50, exchanged a surprised and even frightened look with the young man. That Nekhlyudov, instead of scolding and driving them away, as was natural to a gentleman, should give up his seat to them, astonished and perplexed them. They even feared that this might have some evil result for them. However, they soon noticed that there was no underlying plot when they heard Nekhlyudov talking quite simply with Taras, and they grew quiet and told one of the lads to sit down on his bag and give his seat to Nekhlyudov. At first the elderly workman who sat opposite Nekhlyudov shrank and drew back his legs for fear of touching the gentleman, but after a while he grew quite friendly, and in talking to him and Taras even slapped Nekhlyudov on the knee when he wanted to draw special attention to what he was saying. He told them all about his position and his work in the peat bogs, whence he was now returning home. He had been working there for 2.5 months, and was bringing home his wages, which only came to 10 roubles, since part had been paid beforehand when he was hired. They worked, as he explained, up to their knees in water from sunrise to sunset, with 2 hours interval for dinner. Those who are not used to it find it hard, of course, he said, but when one's hardened it doesn't matter, if only the food is right. At first the food was bad. Later the people complained, and they got good food, and it was easy to work. Then he told them how, during 28 years he went out to work, and sent all his earnings home, first to his father, then to his eldest brother, and now to his nephew, who was at the head of the household. On himself he spent only 2 or 3 roubles out of the 50 or 60 he earned in a year, just for luxuries, tobacco and matches. "I'm a sinner. When tired I even drink a little vodka sometimes," he added with a guilty smile. Then he told them how the women did the work at home, and how the contractor had treated them to half a pail of vodka before they started today, how one of them had died, and another was returning home ill. The sick workman he was talking about was in a corner of the same carriage. He was a young lad, with a pale, sallow face and bluish lips. He was evidently tormented by intermittent fever. Nekhludoff went up to him, but the lad looked up with such a severe and suffering expression that Nekhludoff did not care to bother him with questions, but advised the elder man to give him quinine, and wrote down the name of the medicine. He wished to give him some money, but the old workman said he would pay for it himself. Well, much as I have travelled, I have never met such a gentleman before. Instead of punching your head, he actually gives up his place to you, said the old man to Taras. It seems there are all sorts of gentlefolk, too. Yes, this is quite a new and different world, thought Nekhludoff, looking at these spare, sinewy limbs, coarse, home-made garments, and sunburnt, kindly, though weary-looking faces, and feeling himself surrounded on all sides with new people and the serious interests, joys, and sufferings of a life of labour. Here is le vrai grand monde, thought Nekhludoff, remembering the words of Prince Korchagin, and all that idle, luxurious world to which the Korchagins belonged, with their petty, mean interests, and he felt the joy of a traveller on discovering a new, unknown, and beautiful world. End of Book 2, Chapter 42. End of Book 2 of Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Louise Maud.